Chapter the 8th, Book the First of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Alice Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the First, Chapter the 8th. The Lock. Arthur Clennam stood in the street, waiting to ask some passer-by what place that was. He suffered a few people to pass him in whose face there was no encouragement to make the inquiry, and still stood pausing in the street, when an old man came up and turned into the courtyard. He stooped a good deal, and plodded along in a slow preoccupied manner, which made the bustling London thoroughfares no very safe resort for him. He was dirtily and meanly dressed, in a threadbare coat, once blue, reaching to his ankles and buttoned to his chin, where it vanished in the pale ghost of a velvet collar. A piece of red cloth with which that phantom had been stiffened in its lifetime was now laid bare, and poked itself up at the back of the old man's neck, into a confusion of great hair and rusty stock and buckle, which altogether nearly poked his hat off. A greasy hat it was, and a napless, impending over his eyes, cracked and crumpled at the brim, and with a wisp of pocket-handkerchief dangling out below it. His trousers were so long and loose, and his shoes so clumsy and large, that he shuffled like an elephant, though how much of this was gait, and how much trailing cloth and leather, no one could have told. Under one arm he carried a limp and worn-out case, containing some wind instrument. In the same hand he had a pennyworth of snuff in a little packet of whitey brown paper, from which he slowly comforted his poor blue old nose with a lengthened out pinch, as Arthur Clennam looked at him. To this old man crossing the courtyard he preferred his inquiry, touching him on the shoulder. The old man stopped and looked round, with the expression in his weak grey eyes of one whose thought had been far off, and who was a little dull of hearing also. "Pray, sir," said Arthur, repeating his question, "what is this place?"
"Aye, this place,"
returned the old man, staying his pinch of snuff on its road, and pointing at the place without looking at it.
"This is the Marshalsea, sir."
"The debtors' prison?"
"Sir,"
said the old man, with the air of deeming it not quite necessary to insist upon that designation. "The debtors' prison." He turned himself about and went on. "I beg your pardon," said Arthur, stopping him once more, "but will you allow me to ask you another question? Can any one go in here?"
"Any one can go in,"
replied the old man, plainly adding by the significance of his emphasis,
"but it is not every one who can go out."
"Pardon me once more. Are you familiar with the place?"
"Sir,"
returned the old man, squeezing his little packet of snuff in his hand, and turning upon his interrogator as if such questions hurt him.
"I am."
"I beg you to excuse me. I am not impertinently curious, but have a good object. Do you know the name of Dorrit here?"
"My name, sir,"
replied the old man most unexpectedly,
"is Dorrit."
Arthur pulled off his hat to him. "Grant me the favour of half a dozen words. I was wholly unprepared for your announcement, and hope that assurance is my sufficient apology for having taken the liberty of addressing you. I have recently come home to England after a long absence. I have seen at my mother's, Mrs. Clennam, in the city, a young woman working at her needle, whom I have only heard addressed or spoken of as Little Dorrit. I have felt sincerely interested in her, and have had a great desire to know something more about her. I saw her, not a minute before you came up, pass in at that door." The old man looked at him attentively.
"Are you a sailor, sir?"
he asked. He seemed a little disappointed by the shake of the head that replied to him.
"Not a sailor? I judged from your sunburnt face that you might be. Are you in earnest, sir?"
"I do assure you that I am, and do entreat you to believe that I am in plain earnest."
"I know very little of the world, sir,"
returned the other, who had a weak and quavering voice.
"I am merely passing on, like the shadow over the sundial. It would be worth no man's while to mislead me. It would really be too easy, too poor a success, to yield any satisfaction. The young woman whom you saw go in here is my brother's child. My brother is William Dorrit. I am Frederick. You say you have seen her at your mother's. I know your mother befriends her. You have felt an interest in her, and you wish to know what she does here. Come and see."
He went on again, and Arthur accompanied him.
"My brother,"
said the old man, pausing on the step and slowly facing round again,
"has been here many years, and much that happens even among ourselves out of doors is kept from him for reasons that I needn't enter upon now. Be so good as to say nothing of my niece's working at her needle. Be so good as to say nothing that goes beyond what is said among us. If you keep within our bounds, you cannot well be wrong. Now, come and see."
Arthur followed him down a narrow entry, at the end of which a key was turned, and a strong door was opened from within. It admitted them into a lodge or lobby, across which they passed, and so through another door and a grating into the prison. The old man, always plodding on before, turned round in his slow, stiff, stooping manner when they came to the turnkey on duty, as if to present his companion. The turnkey nodded, and the companion passed in without being asked whom he wanted. The night was dark, and the prison lamps in the yard, and the candles in the prison windows faintly shining behind many sorts of wry old curtain and blind, had not the air of making it lighter. A few people loitered about, but the greater part of the population was within doors. The old man, taking the right-hand side of the yard, turned in at the third or fourth doorway, and began to ascend the stairs.
"They are rather dark, sir, but you will not find anything in the way."
He paused for a moment before opening a door on the second story. He had no sooner turned the handle than the visitor saw little Dorrit, and saw the reason of her setting so much store by dining alone. She had brought the meat home that she should have eaten herself, and was already warming it on a gridiron over the fire for her father, clad in an old grey gown and a black cap, awaiting his supper at the table. A clean cloth was spread before him, with knife, fork, and spoon, salt cellar, pepper box, glass, and pewter ale pot. Such zests as his particular little phial of cayenne pepper and his pennyworth of pickles in a saucer were not wanting. She started, coloured deeply, and turned white. The visitor, more with his eyes than by the slight impulsive motion of his hand, entreated her to be reassured and to trust him.
"I found this gentleman,"
said the uncle.
"Mr. Clennam, William, son of Amy's friend, at the outer gate, wishful as he was going by of paying his respects by hesitating whether to come in or not. This is my brother William, sir."
"I hope," said Arthur, very doubtful what to say, "that my respect for your daughter may explain and justify my desire to be presented to you, sir."
"Mr. Clennam,"
returned the other, rising, taking his cap off in the flat of his hand, and so holding it, ready to put on again,
"you do me honour. You are welcome, sir,"
with a low bow.
"Frederick, a chair. Pray sit down, Mr. Clennam."
He put his black cap on again as he had taken it off, and resumed his own seat. There was a wonderful air of benignity and patronage in his manner. These were the ceremonies with which he received the collegians.
"You are welcome to the Marshalsea, sir. I have welcomed many gentlemen to these walls. Perhaps you are aware, my daughter Amy may have mentioned that I am the father of this place."
So I have understood," said Arthur, dashing at the assertion.
"You know, I dare say, that my daughter Amy was born here. A good girl, sir, a dear girl, and long a comfort and support to me. Amy, my dear, put this dish on. Mr. Clennam will excuse the primitive customs to which we are reduced here. It is a compliment to ask you if you would do me the honour, sir, to—"
"Thank you," returned Arthur, "not a morsel." He felt himself quite lost in wonder at the manner of the man, and that the probability of his daughter's having had a reserve as to her family history should be so far out of his mind. She filled his glass, put all the little matters on the table ready to his hand, and then sat beside him while he ate his supper. Evidently in observance of their nightly custom, she put some bread before herself, and touched his glass with her lips. But Arthur saw she was troubled and took nothing. Her look at her father, half admiring him and proud of him, half ashamed for him, all devoted and loving, went to his inmost heart. The father of the Marshalsea condescended towards his brother as an amiable, well-meaning man, a private character who had not arrived at distinction.
"Frederick," said he, "you and Fanny sup at your lodgings to-night, I know. What have you done with Fanny, Frederick?" "She is walking with Tip." "Tip, as you may know, is my son, Mr. Clennam. He has been a little wild and difficult to settle, but his introduction to the world was rather—" He shrugged his shoulders with a faint sigh, and looked round the room. "A little adverse. Your first visit here, sir?"
"My first."
"You could hardly have been here since your boyhood without my knowledge. It very seldom happens that anybody of any pretensions, comes here without being presented to me. As many as 40 or 50 in a day have been introduced to my brother," said Frederick, faintly lighting up with a ray of pride. "Yes," the father of the Marshalsea assented. "We have even exceeded that number. On a fine Sunday in term time, it is quite a levee, quite a levee. Amy, my dear, I have been trying half the day to remember the name of the gentleman from Camberwell, who was introduced to me last Christmas week by that agreeable coal merchant who was remanded for 6 months.
"I don't remember his name, father."
"Frederick, do you remember his name?"
Frederick doubted if he had ever heard it. No one could doubt that Frederick was the last person upon earth to put such a question to, with any hope of information.
"I mean,"
said his brother,
"the gentleman who did that handsome action with so much delicacy. Ha! Tush! The name has quite escaped me. Mr. Clennam, as I have happened to mention handsome and delicate action, you may like perhaps to know what it was."
"Very much," said Arthur, withdrawing his eyes from the delicate head beginning to droop, and the pale face with a new solicitude stealing over it.
"It is so generous and shows so much fine feeling that it is almost a duty to mention it. I said at the time that I always would mention it on every suitable occasion, without regard to personal sensitiveness. It's of no use to disguise the fact. You must know, Mr. Clennam, that it does sometimes occur that people who come here desire to offer some little testimonial to the father of the place."
To see her hand upon his arm in mute entreaty half repressed, and her timid little shrinking figure turning away, was to see a sad, sad sight.
"Sometimes,"
he went on in a low, soft voice, agitated and clearing his throat every now and then,
"sometimes it takes one shape and sometimes another, but it is generally money, and it is, I cannot but confess it, it is too often acceptable. This gentleman that I refer to was presented to me, Mr. Clennam, in a manner highly gratifying to my feelings, and conversed not only with great politeness, but with great information."
All this time, though he had finished his supper, he was nervously going about his plate with his knife and fork, as if some of it were still before him.
"It appeared from his conversation that he had a garden, though he was delicate of mentioning it at first, as gardens are not accessible to me, but it came out through my admiring a very fine cluster of geranium, beautiful cluster of geranium to be sure, which he had brought from his conservatory. On my taking notice of its rich colour, he showed me a piece of paper round it, on which was written, 'For the father of the Marshalsea,' and presented it to me. But this was not all. He made a particular request, on taking leave, that I would remove the paper in half an hour, I did so, and I found that it contained 2 guineas. I assure you, Mr. Clennam, I received testimonials in many ways, and of many degrees of value, and they have always been unfortunately acceptable. But I never was more pleased than with this particular testimonial.
Arthur was in the act of saying the little he could say on such a theme, when a bell began to ring, and footsteps approached the door. A pretty girl of a far better figure and much more developed than little Dorrit, though looking much younger in the face when the two were observed together, stopped in the doorway on seeing a stranger, and a young man who was with her stopped too.
"Mr. Clennam, Fanny, my eldest daughter and my son, Mr. Clennam. The bell is a signal for visitors to retire, and so they have come to say good night. But there is plenty of time, plenty of time. Girls, Mr. Clennam will excuse any household business you may have together. He knows, I dare say, that I have but one room here."
"I only want my clean dress from Amy, father," said the second girl. "And I my clothes," said Tip. Amy opened a drawer in an old piece of furniture that was a chest of drawers above and a bedstead below, and produced 2 little bundles, which she handed to her brother and sister. "Mended and made up?" Clennam heard the sister ask in a whisper, to which Amy answered, "Yes." He had risen now, and took the opportunity of glancing round the room. The bare walls had been coloured green, evidently by an unskilled hand, and were poorly decorated with a few prints. The window was curtained and the floor carpeted, and there were shelves and pegs, and other such conveniences that had accumulated in the course of years. It was a close, confined room, poorly furnished, and the chimney smoked to boot, or the tin screen at the top of the fireplace was superfluous, but constant pains and care had made it neat, and even, after its kind, comfortable. All the while the bell was ringing, and the uncle was anxious to go.
Come, Fanny,
he said with his ragged clarionet case under his arm.
"The lock, child, the lock."
Fanny bade her father good night and whisked off airily. Tip had already clattered downstairs.
"Now, Mr. Clennam,"
said the uncle, looking back as he shuffled out after them.
"The lock, sir, the lock."
Mr. Clennam had 2 things to do before he followed. 1, to offer his testimonial to the Father of the Marshalsea, without giving pain to his child. The other, to say something to that child, though it were but a word, in explanation of his having come there.
"Allow me," said the father, "to see you downstairs."
She had slipped out after the rest, and they were alone. "Not on any account," said the visitor hurriedly. "Pray allow me to—" Chink, chink, chink.
"Mr. Clennam," said the father, "I am deeply, deeply—"
But his visitor had shut up his hand to stop the clinking, and had gone downstairs with great speed. He saw no little Dorrit on his way down, or in the yard. The last 2 or 3 stragglers were hurrying to the lodge, and he was following, when he caught sight of her in the doorway of the first house from the entrance. He turned back hastily. "Pray forgive me," he said, "for speaking to you here. Pray forgive me for coming here at all. I followed you tonight. I did so that I might endeavour to render you and your family some service. You know the terms on which I and my mother are, and may not be surprised that I have preserved our distant relations at her house, lest I should unintentionally make her jealous or resentful, or do you any injury in her estimation. What I have seen here, in this short time, has greatly increased my heartfelt wish to be a friend to you. It would recompense me for much disappointment if I could hope to gain your confidence." She was scared at first, but seemed to take courage while he spoke to her. "You are very good, sir. You speak very earnestly to me, but I wish you had not watched me." You understood the emotion with which she said it, to arise in her father's behalf, and he respected it, and was silent. "Mrs. Clennam has been of great service to me. I don't know what we should have done without the employment she has given me. I am afraid it may not be a good return to become secret with her. I can say no more to-night, sir. I'm sure you mean to be kind to us. Thank you, thank you. Let me ask you one question before I leave. Have you known my mother long? I think 2 years, sir. The bell has stopped. How did you know her first? Did she send here for you? No, she does not even know that I live here. We have a friend, father and I, a poor labouring man, but the best of friends, and I wrote out that I wished to do needlework, and gave his address. And he got what I wrote out displayed at a few places where it cost nothing, and Mrs. Clennam found me that way, and sent for me. The gate will be locked, sir. She was so tremulous and agitated, and he was so moved by compassion for her, and by deep interest in her story as it dawned upon him, that he could scarcely tear himself away. But the stoppage of the bell and the quiet in the prison were a warning to depart, and with a few hurried words of kindness he left her gliding back to her father. But he remained too late. The inner gate was locked, and the lodge closed. After a little fruitless knocking with his hand, he was standing there with a disagreeable conviction upon him that he had got to get through the night, when a voice accosted him from behind. "Caught, eh?" said the voice. "You won't go home till morning. Oh, it's you, is it, Mr. Clennam?" The voice was Tip's, and they stood looking at one another in the prison yard as it began to rain. "You've done it," observed Tip. "You must be sharper than that next time." "But you are locked in too," said Arthur. "I believe I am," said Tip sarcastically. "About, but not in your way. I belong to the shop, only my sister has a theory that our governor must never know it. I don't see why, myself." "Can I get any shelter?" asked Arthur. "What had I better do?" "We had better get hold of Amy first of all," said Tip, referring any difficulty to her as a matter of course. "I would rather walk about all night. It's not much to do, than give that trouble." "You needn't do that if you don't mind paying for a bed. If you don't mind paying, they'll make you up one on the snuggery table, under the circumstances. If you'll come along, I'll introduce you there." As they passed down the yard, Arthur looked up at the window of the room he had lately left, where the light was still burning. "Yes, sir," said Tip, following his glance. "That's the governor's. She'll sit with him for another hour reading yesterday's paper to him, or something of that sort, and then she'll come out like a little ghost and vanish away without a sound." "I don't understand you." "The governor sleeps up in the room, and she has a lodging at the Turnkeys. First house there," said Tip, pointing out the doorway into which she had retired. "First house, sky parlour. She pays twice as much for it as she would for one twice as good outside. But she stands by the governor, poor dear girl, day and night." This brought them to the tavern establishment at the upper end of the prison, where the collegians had just vacated their social evening club. The apartment on the ground floor in which it was held was the snuggery in question. The presidential tribune of the chairman, the pewter pots, glasses, pipes, tobacco ashes, and general flavour of members was still as that convivial institution had left them on its adjournment. The snuggery had two of the qualities popularly held to be essential to grog for ladies, in respect that it was hot and strong, but in the third point of analogy, requiring plenty of it, the snuggery was defective, being but a cooped-up apartment. The unaccustomed visitor from outside naturally assumed everybody here to be prisoners, landlord, waiter, barmaid, potboy, and all. Whether they were or not did not appear, but they all had a weedy look. The keeper of a chandler's shop in a front parlour, who took in gentlemen boarders, lent his assistance in making the bed. He had been a tailor in his time, and had kept a phaeton, he said. He boasted that he stood up litigiously for the interests of the college, and he had undefined and undefinable ideas that the marshal intercepted a fund which ought to come to the collegians. He liked to believe this, and always impressed the shadowy grievance on newcomers and strangers, though he could not for his life have explained what fund he meant, or how the notion had got rooted in his soul. He had fully convinced himself, notwithstanding, that his own proper share of the fund was 3 and 9pence a week, and that in this amount he, as an individual collegian, was swindled by the marshal regularly every Monday. Apparently he helped to make the bed that he might not lose an opportunity of stating this case, after which unloading of his mind, and after announcing, as it seemed he always did without anything coming of it, that he was going to write a letter to the papers and show the marshal up, he fell into miscellaneous conversation with the rest. It was evident from the general tone of the whole party that they had come to regard insolvency as the normal state of mankind, and the payment of debts as a disease that occasionally broke out. In this strange scene, and with these strange spectres flitting about him, Arthur Clennam looked on at the preparations as if they were part of a dream, pending which the long-initiated Tip, with an awful enjoyment of the snuggery's resources, pointed out the common kitchen fire maintained by subscription of collegians, the boiler for hot water supported in like manner, and other premises generally tending to the deduction that the way to be healthy, wealthy, and wise was to come to the Marshalsea. The 2 tables put together in a corner were at length converted into a very fair bed, and the stranger was left to the Windsor chair, the presidential tribune, the beery atmosphere, sawdust, pipe lights, spittoons, and repose. But the last item was long, long, long in linking itself to the rest. The novelty of the place, the coming upon it without preparation, the sense of being locked up, the remembrance of that room upstairs, of the 2 brothers, and above all of the retiring childish form, and the face in which he now saw years of insufficient food, if not of want, kept him waking and unhappy. Speculations, too, bearing the strangest relations towards the prison, but always concerning the prison, ran like nightmares through his mind while he lay awake. Whether coffins were kept ready for people who might die there, where they were kept, how they were kept, where people who died in the prison were buried, how they were taken out, what forms were observed, whether an implacable creditor could arrest the dead. As to escaping, what chances there were of escape, whether a prisoner could scale the walls with a cord and grapple, how he could descend upon the other side, whether he could alight on a housetop, steal down a staircase, let himself out at a door, and get lost in the crowd. As to fire in the prison, if one were to break out while he lay there. And these involuntary starts of fancy were, after all, but the setting of a picture in which 3 people kept before him. His father, with the steadfast look with which he had died, prophetically darkened forth in the portrait; his mother, with her arm up, warding off his suspicion; little Dorrit, with her hand on the degraded arm, and her drooping head turned away. What if his mother had an old reason she well knew for softening to this poor girl? What if the prisoner now sleeping quietly, heaven granted, by the light of the great day of judgment should trace back his fall to her? What if any act of hers and of his father's should have even remotely brought the grey heads of those 2 brothers so low? A swift thought shot into his mind. In that long imprisonment here, and in her own long confinement to her room, did his mother find a balance to be struck? I admit that I was accessory to that man's captivity. I have suffered for it in kind. He has decayed in his prison. I, in mine. I have paid the penalty. When all the other thoughts had faded out, this one held possession of him. When he fell asleep, she came before him in her wheeled chair, warding him off with this justification. When he awoke, and sprang up causelessly frightened, the words were in his ears, as if her voice had slowly spoken them at his pillow to break his rest. He withers away in his prison, I wither away in mine. Inexorable justice is done. What do I owe on this score? End of chapter the 8th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 9th, Book the First of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the First. Chapter the 9th. Little Mother. The morning light was in no hurry to climb the prison wall and look in at the snuggery windows, and when it did come, it would have been more welcome if it had come alone, instead of bringing a rush of rain with it. But the equinoctial gales were blowing out at sea, and the impartial south-west wind, in its flight, would not neglect even the narrow Marshalsea. While it roared through the steeple of St. George's Church, and twirled all the cowls in the neighbourhood, it made a swoop to beat the Southwark smoke into the jail, and, plunging down the chimneys of the few early collegians who were yet lighting their fires, half suffocated them. Arthur Clennam would have been little disposed to linger in bed, though his bed had been in a more private situation, and less affected by the raking out of yesterday's fire, the kindling of today's under the collegiate boiler, the filling of that Spartan vessel at the pump, the sweeping and sawdusting of the common room, and other such preparations. Heartily glad to see the morning, though little rested by the night, he turned out as soon as he could distinguish objects about him, and paced the yard for 2 heavy hours before the gate was opened. The walls were so near to one another, and the wild clouds hurried over them so fast, that it gave him a sensation like the beginning of sea-sickness to look up at the gusty sky. The rain, carried aslant by flaws of wind, blackened that side of the central building which he had visited last night, but left a narrow dry trough under the lee of the wall, where he walked up and down among the weights of straw and dust and paper, the waste droppings of the pump, and the straw leaves of yesterday's greens. It was a haggard view of life as a man need look upon. Nor was it relieved by any glimpse of the little creature who had brought him there. Perhaps she glided out of her doorway and in at that where her father lived, while his face was turned from both. But he saw nothing of her. It was too early for her brother. To have seen him once was to have seen enough of him to know that he would be sluggish to leave whatever frowsy bed he occupied at night. So, as Arthur Clennam walked up and down, waiting for the gate to open, he cast about in his mind for future rather than for present means of pursuing his discoveries. At last the lodge gate turned, and the turnkey, standing on the step, taking an early comb at his hair, was ready to let him out. With a joyful sense of release he passed through the lodge, and found himself again in the little outer courtyard, where he had spoken to the brother last night. There was a string of people already straggling in, whom it was not difficult to identify as the nondescript messengers, go-betweens, and errand-bearers of the place. Some of them had been lounging in the rain until the gate should open. Others, who had timed their arrival with greater nicety, were coming up now, and passing in with damp whitey brown paper bags from the grocer's, loaves of bread, lumps of butter, eggs, milk, and the like. The shabbiness of these attendants upon shabbiness, the poverty of these insolvent waiters upon insolvency, was a sight to see. Such threadbare coats and trousers, such fusty gowns and shawls, such squashed hats and bonnets, such boots and shoes, such umbrellas and walking sticks, never were seen in rag fair. All of them wore the cast-off clothes of other men and women, were made up of patches and pieces of other people's individuality, and had no sartorial existence of their own proper. Their walk was the walk of a race apart. They had a peculiar way of doggedly slinking round the corner, as if they were eternally going to the pawnbroker's. When they coughed like people accustomed to be forgotten on doorsteps and in draughty passages, waiting for answers to letters in faded ink, which gave the recipients of those manuscripts great mental disturbance and no satisfaction. As they eyed the stranger in passing, they eyed him with borrowing eyes, hungry, sharp, speculative as to his softness if they were accredited to him, and the likelihood of his standing something handsome. Mendicity on commission stooped in their high shoulders, shambled in their unsteady legs, buttoned and pinned and darned and dragged their clothes, frayed with button-holes, leaked out of their figures in dirty little ends of tape, and issued from their mouths in alcoholic breathings. As these people passed him standing still in the courtyard, and one of them turned back to inquire if he could assist him with his services, it came into Arthur Clennam's mind that he would speak to little Dorrit again before he went away. She would have recovered her first surprise, and might feel easier with him. He asked this member of the fraternity, who had 2 red herrings in his hand, and a loaf and a blacking brush under his arm, where was the nearest place to get a cup of coffee at. The nondescript replied in encouraging terms, and brought him to a coffee shop in the street within a stone's throw. "Do you know Miss Dorrit?" asked the new client. The nondescript knew 2 Miss Dorrits, one who was born inside. That was the one. That was the one? The nondescript had known her many years. In regard of the other Miss Dorrit, the nondescript lodged in the same house with herself and uncle. This changed the client's half-formed design of remaining at the coffee shop until the nondescript should bring him word that Dorrit had issued forth into the street. He entrusted the nondescript with a confidential message to her, importing that the visitor who had waited on her father last night begged the favour of a few words with her at her uncle's lodging. He obtained from the same source full directions to the house, which was very near, dismissed the nondescript gratified with half-a-crown, and having hastily refreshed himself at the coffee shop, repaired with all speed to the clarionet player's dwelling. There were so many lodgers in this house that the door-post seemed to be as full of bell-handles as a cathedral organ is of stops. Doubtful which might be the clarionet stop, he was considering the point, when a shuttlecock flew out of the parlour window and alighted on his hat. He then observed that in the parlour window was a blind with the inscription, "Mr. Cripple's Academy." Also in another line, "Evening Tuition," and behind the blind was a little white-faced boy with a slice of bread and butter and a battledore. The window being accessible from the footway, he looked in over the blind, returned the shuttlecock, and put his question. "Dorrit?" said the little white-faced boy, Master Cripples, in fact. "Mr. Dorrit? That bell and one knock." The pupils of Mr. Cripples appeared to have been making a copybook of the street door, it was so extensively scribbled over in pencil. The frequency of the inscriptions, Old Dorrit and Dirty Dick, in combination, suggested intentions of personality on the part of Mr. Cripple's pupils. There was ample time to make these observations before the door was opened by the poor old man himself.
"Ha!"
said he, very slowly remembering Arthur.
"You were shut in last night?"
"Yes, Mr. Dorrit. I hope to meet your niece here presently."
"Oh,"
said he, pondering.
"Out of my brother's way? True. Would you come upstairs and wait for her?"
"Thank you." Turning himself as slowly as he turned in his mind whatever he heard or said, he led the way up the narrow stairs. The house was very close, and had an unwholesome smell. The little staircase windows looked in at the back windows of other houses as unwholesome as itself, with poles and lines thrust out of them, on which unsightly linen hung, as if the inhabitants were angling for clothes, and had had some wretched bites not worth attending to. In the back garret, a sickly room with a turn-up bedstead in it, so hastily and recently turned up that the blankets were boiling over, as it were, and keeping the lid open, a half-finished breakfast of coffee and toast for 2 persons was jumbled down anyhow on a rickety table. There was no one there. The old man, mumbling to himself, after some consideration, that Fanny had run away, went to the next room to fetch her back. The visitor, observing that she held the door on the inside, and that, when the uncle tried to open it, there was a sharp adjuration of "Don't, stupid!" and an appearance of loose stocking and flannel, concluded that the young lady was in an undress. The uncle, without appearing to come to any conclusion, shuffled in again, sat down in his chair, and began warming his hands at the fire. Not that it was cold, or that he had any waking idea whether it was or not.
"What did you think of my brother, sir?"
he asked, when he by and by discovered what he was doing, left off, reached over to the chimney-piece, and took his clarionet case down. "I was glad," said Arthur, very much at a loss, for his thoughts were on the brother before him, "to find him so well and cheerful."
"Ha!"
muttered the old man.
"Yes, yes, 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 yes."
Arthur wondered what he could possibly want with the clarionet case. He did not want it at all. He discovered, in due time, that it was not the little paper of snuff, which was also on the chimney-piece, put it back again, took down the snuff instead, and solaced himself with a pinch. He was as feeble, spare, and slow in his pinches as in everything else, but a certain little trickling of enjoyment of them played in the poor worn nerves about the corners of his eyes and mouth.
"Amy, Mr. Clennam, what do you think of her?"
"I am much impressed, Mr. Dorrit, by all that I have seen of her and thought of her."
"My brother would have been quite lost without Amy," he returned. "We should all have been lost without Amy. She is a very good girl, Amy. She does her duty."
Arthur fancied that he had heard in these praises a certain tone of custom, which he had heard from the father last night with an inward protest and feeling of antagonism. It was not that they stinted her praises, or were insensible to what she did for them, but that they were lazily habituated to her as they were to all the rest of their condition. He fancied that although they had before them, every day, the means of comparison between her and one another, and themselves, they regarded her as being in her necessary place, as holding a position towards them all which belonged to her, like her name or her age. He fancied that they viewed her, not as having risen away from the prison atmosphere, but as appertaining to it, as being vaguely what they had a right to expect, and nothing more. Her uncle resumed his breakfast, and was munching toast sopped in coffee, oblivious of his guest, when the third bell rang. That was Amy, he said, and went down to let her in, leaving the visitor with as vivid a picture on his mind of his begrimed hands, dirt-worn face, and decayed figure, as if he were still drooping in his chair. She came up after him in the usual plain dress, and with the usual timid manner. Her lips were a little parted, as if her heart beat faster than usual.
"Mr. Clennam, Amy,"
said her uncle,
"has been expecting you some time."
"I took the liberty of sending you a message." "I received the message, sir." "Are you going to my mother's this morning?" "I think not, for it is past your usual hour." "Not to-day, sir. I am not wanted to-day." "Will you allow me to walk a little way in whatever direction you may be going? I can then speak to you as we walk, both without detaining you here, and without intruding longer here myself." She looked embarrassed, but said, if he pleased. He made a pretence of having mislaid his walking-stick, to give her time to set the bedstead right, to answer her sister's impatient knock at the wall, and to say a word softly to her uncle. Then he found it, and they went downstairs. She first, he following, the uncle standing at the stair-head, and probably forgetting them before they had reached the ground floor. Mr. Cripple's pupils, who were by this time coming to school, desisted from their morning recreation of cuffing one another with bags and books, to stare with all the eyes they had at a stranger who had been to see Dirty Dick. They bore the trying spectacle in silence until the mysterious visitor was at a safe distance, when they burst into pebbles and yells, and likewise into reviling dances, and in all respects buried the pipe of peace with so many savage ceremonies, that if Mr. Cripples had been the chief of the Crippleway boot tribe with his war paint on, they could scarcely have done greater justice to their education. In the midst of this homage, Mr. Arthur Clennam offered his arm to little Dorrit, and little Dorrit took it. "Will you go by the iron bridge?" said he, "where there is an escape from the noise of the street?" Little Dorrit answered, if he pleased, and presently ventured to hope that he would not mind Mr. Cripple's boys, for she had herself received her education, such as it was, in Mr. Cripple's evening academy. He returned with the best will in the world that Mr. Cripple's boys were forgiven out of the bottom of his soul. Thus did Cripples unconsciously become a master of the ceremonies between them, and bring them more naturally together than Beau Nash might have done if they had lived in his golden days, and he had alighted from his coach and six for the purpose. The morning remained squally, and the streets were miserably muddy, but no rain fell as they walked towards the iron bridge. The little creature seemed so young in his eyes that there were moments when he found himself thinking of her, if not speaking to her, as if she were a child. Perhaps he seemed as old in her eyes as she seemed young in his. "I am sorry to hear you were so inconvenienced last night, sir, as to be locked in. It was very unfortunate." "It was nothing," he returned. "You had had a very good bed." "Oh, yes," she said quickly. She believed there were excellent beds at the coffee house. He noticed that the coffee house was quite a majestic hotel to her, and that she treasured its reputation. "I believe it is very expensive," said little Dorrit, "but my father has told me that quite beautiful dinners may be got there, and wine," she added timidly. "Were you ever there?" "Oh, no, only into the kitchen to fetch hot water." To think of growing up with a kind of awe upon one as to the luxuries of that superb establishment, the Marshalsea Hotel. "I asked you last night," said Clennam, "how you had become acquainted with my mother. Did you ever hear her name before she sent for you?" "No, sir." "Do you think your father ever did?" "No, sir." He met her eyes raised to his with so much wonder in them, she was scared when the encounter took place, and shrank away again, that he felt it necessary to say, "I have a reason for asking which I cannot very well explain, but you must on no account suppose it to be of a nature to cause you the least alarm or anxiety. Quite the reverse. And you think that at no time of your father's life was my name of Clennam ever familiar to him?" "No, sir." He felt, from the tone in which she spoke, that she was glancing up at him with those parted lips. Therefore he looked before him, rather than make her heart beat quicker still by embarrassing her afresh. Thus they emerged upon the iron bridge, which was as quiet after the roaring streets as though it had been open country. The wind blew roughly. The wet squalls came rattling past them, skimming the pools on the road and pavement, and draining them down into the river. The clouds raced on furiously in the lead-coloured sky. The smoke and mist raced after them. The dark tide ran fierce and strong in the same direction. Little Dorrit seemed the least, the quietest, and weakest of heaven's creatures. "Let me put you in a coach," said Clennam, very nearly adding, "my poor child." She hurriedly declined, saying that wet or dry made little difference to her. She was used to go about in all weathers. He knew it to be so, and was touched with more pity, thinking of the slight figure at his side, making its nightly way through the damp, dark, boisterous streets to such a place of rest. "You spoke so feelingly to me last night, sir, and I found afterwards that you had been so generous to my father, that I could not resist your message, if it was only to thank you, especially as I wished very much to say to you—" She hesitated and trembled, and tears rose in her eyes, but did not fall. "To say to me?" "That I hope you will not misunderstand my father. Don't judge him, sir, as you would judge others outside the gates. He has been there so long. I never saw him outside, but I can understand that he must have grown different in something since. My thoughts will never be unjust or harsh towards him, believe me. Not," she said with a prouder air, as the misgiving evidently crept upon her that she might seem to be abandoning him, "not that he has anything to be ashamed of for himself, or that I have anything to be ashamed of for him. He only requires to be understood. I only ask for him that his life may be fairly remembered. All that he said was quite true. It all happened just as he related it. He is very much respected. Everybody who comes in is glad to know him. He is more courted than anyone else. He is far more thought of than the Marshal is." If ever pride was innocent, it was innocent in little Dorrit when she grew boastful of her father. It is often said that his manners are a true gentleman's, and quite a study. I see none like them in that place, but he is admitted to be superior to all the rest. This is quite as much why they make him presents, as because they know him to be needy. He is not to be blamed for being in need, poor love. Who could be in prison a quarter of a century and be prosperous? What affection in her words, what compassion in her repressed tears, what a great soul of fidelity within her, how true the light that shed false brightness round him. If I have found it best to conceal where my home is, it is not because I am ashamed of him, God forbid, nor am I so much ashamed of the place itself as might be supposed. People are not bad because they come there. I have known numbers of good, persevering, honest people come there through misfortune. They are almost all kind-hearted to one another, and it would be ungrateful indeed in me to forget that I have had many quiet, comfortable hours there, that I had an excellent friend there when I was quite a baby, who was very, very fond of me, that I have been taught there, and have worked there, and have slept soundly there. I think it would be almost cowardly and cruel not to have some little attachment for it, after all this. She had relieved the faithful fullness of her heart, and modestly said, raising her eyes appealingly to her new friends, "I did not mean to say so much, nor have I ever but once spoken about this before, but it seems to set it more right than it was last night. I said I wished you had not followed me, sir. I don't wish it so much now, unless you should think, indeed, I don't wish it at all, unless I should have spoken so confusedly, that you can scarcely understand me, which I am afraid may be the case." He told her with perfect truth that it was not the case, and putting himself between her and the sharp wind and rain, sheltered her as well as he could. "I feel permitted now," he said, "to ask you a little more concerning your father. Has he many creditors?" "Oh, a great number." "I mean detaining creditors, who keep him where he is." "Oh yes, a great number." "Can you tell me, I can get the information no doubt elsewhere, if you cannot, who is the most influential of them?" Little Dorrit said, after considering a little, that she used to hear long ago of Mr. Tite Barnacle as a man of great power. He was a commissioner, or a board, or a trustee, or something. He lived in Grosvenor Square, she thought, or very near it. He was under government, high in the Circumlocution Office. She appeared to have acquired, in her infancy, some awful impression of the might of this formidable Mr. Tite Barnacle of Grosvenor Square, or very near it, and the Circumlocution Office, which quite crushed her when she mentioned him. "It can do no harm," thought Arthur, "if I see this Mr. Tite Barnacle." The thought did not present itself so quietly, but that her quickness intercepted it. "Ah," said little Dorrit, shaking her head with the mild despair of a lifetime, "many people used to think once of getting my poor father out, but you don't know how hopeless it is." She forgot to be shy at the moment, in honestly warning him away from the sunken wreck he had a dream of raising, and looked at him with eyes which assuredly, in association with her patient face, her fragile figure, her spare dress, and the wind and rain, did not turn him from his purpose of helping her. "Even if it could be done," said she, "and it never can be done now, where could father live, or how could he live? I have often thought that if such a change could come, it might be anything but a service to him now. People might not think so well of him outside as they do there. He might not be so gently dealt with outside as he is there. He might not be so fit himself for the life outside as he is for that." Here for the first time she could not restrain her tears from falling, and the little thin hands he had watched when they were so busy trembled as they clasped each other. "It would be a new distress to him even to know that I earn a little money, and that Fanny earns a little money. He is so anxious about us, you see, feeling helplessly shut up there. Such a good, good father." He let the little burst of feeling go by before he spoke. It was soon gone. She was not accustomed to think of herself, or to trouble anyone with her emotions. He had but glanced away at the piles of city roofs and chimneys among which the smoke was rolling heavily, and at the wilderness of masts on the river, and the wilderness of steeples on the shore, indistinctly mixed together in the stormy haze, when she was again as quiet as if she had been plying her needle in his mother's room. "You would be glad to have your brother set at liberty?" "Oh, very, very glad, sir." "Well, we will hope for him at least. You told me last night of a friend you had." "His name was Plornish," little Dorrit said. "And where did Plornish live?" "Plornish lived in Bleeding Heart Yard." "He was only a plasterer," little Dorrit said, as a caution to him not to form high social expectations of Plornish. "He lived at the last house in Bleeding Heart Yard, and his name was over a little gateway." Arthur took down the address and gave her his. He had now done all he sought to do for the present, except that he wished to leave her with a reliance upon him, and to have something like a promise from her that she would cherish it. "There is one friend," he said, putting up his pocket-book. "As I take you back, you are going back?" "Oh yes, going straight home." "As I take you back," the word home jarred upon him. "Let me ask you to persuade yourself that you have another friend. I make no professions, and say no more." "You are truly kind to me, sir. I am sure I need no more." They walked back through the miserable muddy streets, and among the poor, mean shops, and were jostled by the crowds of dirty hucksters usual to a poor neighbourhood. There was nothing, by the short way, that was pleasant to any of the five senses. Yet it was not a common passage through common rain, and mire, and noise, to Clennam, having this little, slender, careful creature on his arm. How young she seemed to him, or how old he to her, or what a secret either to the other, in that beginning of the destined interweaving of their stories, matters not here. He thought of her having been born and bred among these scenes, and shrinking through them now, familiar yet misplaced. He thought of her long acquaintance with the squalid needs of life, and of her innocence, of her solicitude for others, and her few years, and her childish aspect. They were come into the high street where the prison stood, when a voice cried, "Little mother! Little mother!" Little Dorrit, stopping and looking back, an excited figure of a strange kind bounced against them, still crying "Little mother," fell down and scattered the contents of a large basket filled with potatoes in the mud. "Oh, Maggie," said little Dorrit, "what a clumsy child you are!" Maggie was not heard, but picked herself up immediately, and then began to pick up the potatoes, in which both little Dorrit and Arthur Clennam helped. Maggie picked up very few potatoes and a great quantity of mud, but they were all recovered and deposited in the basket. Maggie then smeared her muddy face with her shawl, and presenting it to Mr. Clennam as a type of purity, enabled him to see what she was like. She was about 28, with large bones, large features, large feet and hands, large eyes, and no hair. Her large eyes were limpid and almost colourless. They seemed to be very little affected by light, and to stand unnaturally still. There was also that attentive listening expression in her face, which is seen in the face of the blind. But she was not blind, having one tolerably serviceable eye. Her face was not exceedingly ugly, though it was only redeemed from being so by a smile. A good-humoured smile, and pleasant in itself, but rendered pitiable by being constantly there. A great white cap, with a quantity of opaque frilling that was always flapping about, apologized for Maggie's boldness, and made it so very difficult for her old black bonnet to retain its place upon her head, that it held on round her neck like a gypsy's baby. A commission of haberdashers could alone have reported what the rest of her poor dress was made of, but it was a strong general resemblance to seaweed, with here and there a gigantic tea-leaf. Her shawl looked particularly like a tea-leaf after long infusion. Arthur Clennam looked at little Dorrit with the expression of one saying, "May I ask who this is?" Little Dorrit, whose hand this Maggie, still calling her "little mother," had begun to fondle, answered in words. They were under a gateway into which the majority of potatoes had rolled. "This is Maggie, sir." "Maggie, sir," echoed the personage presented.
"Little mother."
"She is the granddaughter," said little Dorrit. "Granddaughter," echoed Maggie, "of my old nurse, who has been dead a long time. Maggie, how old are you?" "10, mother," said Maggie. "You can't think how good she is, sir," said little Dorrit with infinite tenderness. "Good she is," echoed Maggie, transferring the pronoun in a most expressive way from herself to her little mother. "Oh, how clever," said little Dorrit. "She goes on errands as well as anyone." Maggie laughed. "And is as trustworthy as the Bank of England." Maggie laughed. "She earns her own living entirely, entirely, sir," said little Dorrit in a lower and triumphant tone. "Really does." "What is her history?" asked Clennam. "Think of that, Maggie," said little Dorrit, taking her 2 large hands and clapping them together. "A gentleman from thousands of miles away wanting to know your history." "My history?" cried Maggie. "Little mother!" "She means me," said little Dorrit, rather confused. "She is very much attached to me. Her old grandmother was not so kind to her as she should have been. Was she, Maggie?" Maggie shook her head, made a drinking vessel of her clenched left hand, drank out of it and said, "Gin," then beat an imaginary child and said, "Broom handles and pokers." "When Maggie was 10 years old," said little Dorrit, watching her face while she spoke, "she had a bad fever, sir, and she has never grown any older ever since." 10 years old," said Maggie, nodding her head. "But what a nice hospital! So comfortable, wasn't it? Oh, so nice it was! Such an evening place!" "She had never been at peace before, sir," said little Dorrit, turning towards Arthur for an instant and speaking low, "and she always runs off upon that." "Such beds there is there!" cried Maggie. "Such lemonades, such oranges, such delicious broth and wine, such chicken! Oh, ain't it a delightful place to go and stop at?" So Maggie stopped there as long as she could, said little Dorrit in her former tone of telling a child's story, the tone desired for Maggie's ear. And at last, when she could stop there no longer, she came out. Then, because she was never to be more than 10 years old, however long she lived. "However long she lived," echoed Maggie. "And because she was very weak, indeed was so weak that when she began to laugh she couldn't stop herself, which was a great pity." Maggie mighty grave of a sudden. Her grandmother did not know what to do with her, and for some years was very unkind to her indeed. At length, in course of time, Maggie began to take pains to improve herself, and to be very attentive and very industrious, and by degrees was allowed to come in and out as often as she liked, and got enough to do to support herself, and as support herself, and that, said little Dorrit, clapping the 2 great hands together again, is Maggie's history, as Maggie knows. Ah, but Arthur would have known what was wanting to its completeness, though he had never heard of the words little mother, though he had never seen the fondling of the small spare hand, though he had had no sight for the tears now standing in the colourless eyes, though he had had no hearing for the sob that checked the clumsy laugh, the dirty gateway with the wind and rain whistling through it, and the basket of muddy potatoes waiting to be spilled again or taken up, never seemed the common hole it really was, when he looked back to it by these lights. Never, never. They were very near the end of their walk, and they now came out of the gateway to finish it. Nothing would serve Maggie but that they must stop at a grocer's window, short of their destination, for her to show her learning. She could read after a sort, and picked out the fat figures in the tickets of prices, for the most part correctly. She also stumbled with a large balance of success against her failures, through various philanthropic recommendations to try our mixture, try our family black, try our orange-flavoured pekoe, challenging competition at the head of flowery teas, and various cautions to the public against spurious establishments and adulterated articles. When he saw how pleasure brought a rosy tint into little Dorrit's face when Maggie made a hit, he felt that he could have stood there making a library of the grocer's window until the rain and wind were tired. The courtyard received them at last, and there he said good-bye to little Dorrit. Little as she had always looked, she looked less than ever when he saw her going into the Marshalsea Lodge passage, the little mother attended by her big child. The cage door opened, and when the small bird, reared in captivity, had tamely fluttered in, he saw it shut again. And then he came away. End of chapter the 9th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 10th, book the 1st, of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, chapter the 10th. Containing the whole science of government. The Circumlocution Office was, as everybody knows without being told, the most important department under government. No public business of any kind could possibly be done at any time without the acquiescence of the Circumlocution Office. Its finger was in the largest public pie and in the smallest public tart. It was equally impossible to do the plainest right and to undo the plainest wrong without the express authority of the Circumlocution Office. If another gunpowder plot had been discovered half an hour before the lighting of the match, nobody would have been justified in saving the Parliament until there had been half a score of boards, half a bushel of minutes, several sacks of official memoranda, and a family vault full of ungrammatical correspondence on the part of the Circumlocution Office. This glorious establishment had been early in the field, when the one sublime principle involving the difficult art of governing a country was first distinctly revealed to statesmen. It had been foremost to study that bright revelation, and to carry its shining influence through the whole of the official proceedings. Whatever was required to be done, the Circumlocution Office was beforehand with all the public departments in the art of perceiving how not to do it. Through this delicate perception, through the tact with which it invariably seized it, and through the genius with which it always acted on it, the Circumlocution Office had risen to overtop all the public departments, and the public condition had risen to be what it was. It is true that how not to do it was the great study and object of all public departments and professional politicians all round the Circumlocution Office. It is true that every new Premier and every new government, coming in because they had upheld a certain thing as necessary to be done, were no sooner come in than they applied their utmost faculties to discovering how not to do it. It is true that from the moment when a general election was over, every returned man who had been raving on hustings because it hadn't been done, and who had been asking the friends of the honourable gentleman in the opposite interest on pain of impeachment to tell him why it hadn't been done, and who had been asserting that it must be done, and who had been pledging himself that it should be done, began to devise how it was not to be done. It is true that the debates of both Houses of Parliament, the whole session through, uniformly tended to the protracted deliberation how not to do it. It is true that the royal speech at the opening of such session virtually said, "My lords and gentlemen, you have a considerable stroke of work to do, and you will please to retire to your respective chambers, and discuss how not to do it." It is true that the royal speech at the close of such session virtually said, "My lords and gentlemen, you have through several laborious months been considering with great loyalty and patriotism how not to do it, and you have found out, and with the blessing of Providence upon the harvest, natural not political, I now dismiss you. All this is true, but the Circumlocution Office went beyond it. Because the Circumlocution Office went on mechanically every day, keeping this wonderful all-sufficient wheel of statesmanship, how not to do it, in motion, because the Circumlocution Office was down upon any ill-advised public servant who was going to do it, or who appeared to be by any surprising accident in remote danger of doing it, with a minute, and a memorandum, and a letter of instructions that extinguished him. It was this spirit of national efficiency in the Circumlocution Office that had gradually led to its having something to do with everything. Mechanicians, natural philosophers, soldiers, sailors, petitioners, memorialists, people with grievances, people who wanted to prevent grievances, people who wanted to redress grievances, jobbing people, jobbed people, people who couldn't get rewarded for merit, and people who couldn't get punished for demerit, were all indiscriminately tucked up under the foolscap paper of the Circumlocution Office. Numbers of people were lost in the Circumlocution Office, unfortunates with wrongs, or with projects for the general welfare, and they had better have had wrongs at first than have taken that bitter English recipe for certainly getting them, who in slow lapse of time and agony had passed safely through other public departments, who, according to rule, had been bullied in this, overreached by that, and evaded by the other, got referred at last to the Circumlocution Office, and never reappeared in the light of day. Boards sat upon them, secretaries minuted upon them, commissioners gabbled about them, clerks registered, entered, checked, and ticked them off, and they melted away. In short, all the business of the country went through the Circumlocution Office, except the business that never came out of it, and its name was Legion. Sometimes angry spirits attacked the Circumlocution Office. Sometimes parliamentary questions were asked about it, and even parliamentary motions made or threatened about it by demagogues so low and ignorant as to hold that the real recipe of government was how to do it. Then would the noble lord, or right honourable gentleman in whose department it was to defend the Circumlocution Office, put an orange in his pocket, and make a regular field day of the occasion. Then would he come down to that house with a slap upon the table, and meet the honourable gentleman foot to foot. Then would he be there to tell that honourable gentleman that the Circumlocution Office not only was blameless in this matter, but was commendable in this matter, was extollable to the skies in this matter. Then would he be there to tell that honourable gentleman that, although the Circumlocution Office was invariably right and wholly right, it never was so right as in this matter. Then would he be there to tell that honourable gentleman that it would have been more to his honour, more to his credit, more to his good taste, more to his good sense, more to half the dictionary of commonplaces, if he had left the Circumlocution Office alone, and never approached this matter. Then would he keep one eye upon a coach or crammer from the Circumlocution Office sitting below the bar, and smash the honourable gentleman with the Circumlocution Office account of this matter. And although one of two things always happened, namely, either that the Circumlocution Office had nothing to say, and said it, or that it had something to say of which the noble lord, or right honourable gentleman, blundered one half and forgot the other, the Circumlocution Office was always voted immaculate by an accommodating majority. Such a nursery of statesmen had the department become in virtue of a long career of this nature, that several solemn lords had attained the reputation of being quite unearthly prodigies of business, solely from having practised, how not to do it, as the head of the Circumlocution Office. As to the minor priests and acolytes of that temple, the result of all this was that they stood divided into two classes, and, down to the junior messenger, either believed in the Circumlocution Office as a heaven-born institution that had an absolute right to do whatever it liked, or took refuge in total infidelity, and considered it a flagrant nuisance. The Barnacle family had for some time helped to administer the Circumlocution Office. The tight Barnacle branch, indeed, considered themselves in a general way as having vested rights in that direction, and took it ill if any other family had much to say to it. The Barnacles were a very high family, and a very large family. They were dispersed all over the public offices, and held all sorts of public places. Either the nation was under a load of obligation to the Barnacles, or the Barnacles were under a load of obligation to the nation. It was not quite unanimously settled which. The Barnacles having their opinion, the nation theirs. The Mr. Tite Barnacle, who at the period now in question usually coached or crammed the statesman at the head of the Circumlocution Office, when that noble or right honourable individual sat a little uneasily in his saddle by reason of some vagabond making a tilt at him in a newspaper, was more flush of blood than money. As a Barnacle he had his place, which was a snug thing enough, and as a Barnacle he had of course put in his son Barnacle junior in the office. But he had intermarried with a branch of the Still-talkings, who were also better endowed in a sanguineous point of view than with real or personal property, and of this marriage there had been issue, Barnacle junior and 3 young ladies. What with the patrician requirements of Barnacle junior, the 3 young ladies, Mrs. Tite Barnacle, née Stiltstalking, and himself, Mr. Tite Barnacle found the intervals between quarter-day and quarter-day rather longer than he could have desired, a circumstance which he always attributed to the country's parsimony. For Mr. Tite Barnacle, Mr. Arthur Clennam made his 5th inquiry one day at the Circumlocution Office. Having on previous occasions awaited that gentleman successively in a hall, a glass case, a waiting-room, and a fire-proof passage where the department seemed to keep its wind. On this occasion Mr. Barnacle was not engaged, as he had been before, with the noble prodigy at the head of the department, but was absent. Barnacle junior, however, was announced as a lesser star, yet visible above the office horizon. With Barnacle junior he signified his desire to confer, and found that young gentleman singeing the calves of his legs at the parental fire, and supporting his spine against the mantel-shelf. It was a comfortable room, handsomely furnished in the higher official manner, and presenting stately suggestions of the absent Barnacle, in the thick carpet, the leather-covered desk to sit at, the leather-covered desk to stand at, the formidable easy-chair and hearth-rug, the interposed screen, the torn-up papers, the dispatch-boxes with little labour sticking out of them, like medicine-bottles or dead game, the pervading smell of leather and mahogany, and a general bamboozling air of how not to do it. The present Barnacle, holding Mr. Clennam's card in his hand, had a youthful aspect, and the fluffiest little whisker perhaps that ever was seen. Such a downy tip was on his callow chin that he seemed half-fledged like a young bird, and a compassionate observer might have urged that, if he had not singed the calves of his legs, he would have died of cold. He had a superior eye-glass dangling round his neck, but unfortunately had such flat orbits to his eyes, and such limp little eyelids, that it wouldn't stick in when he put it up, but kept tumbling out against his waistcoat buttons with a click that discomposed him very much. "Oh, I say, look here, my father's not in the way, and won't be in the way to-day," said Barnacle junior. "Is this anything that I can do?" Click. Eyeglass down. Barnacle junior quite frightened and feeling all round himself, but not able to find it. "You are very good," said Arthur Clennam. "I wish, however, to see Mr. Barnacle." "But I say, look here, you haven't got any appointment, you know," said Barnacle junior. By this time he had found the eye-glass and put it up again. "No," said Arthur Clennam, "that is what I wish to have." "I say, look here, is this public business?" asked Barnacle junior. Click. Eyeglass down again. Barnacle junior in that state of search after it that Mr. Clennam felt it useless to reply at present. "Is it," said Barnacle junior, taking heed of his visitor's brown face, "anything about tonnage or that sort of thing?" Pausing for a reply, he opened his right eye with his hand, and stuck his glass in it. in that inflammatory manner that his eye began watering dreadfully. "No," said Arthur, "it is nothing about tonnage." "Then look here, is it private business?" "I really am not sure. It relates to a Mr. Dorrit." "Look here, I tell you what, you had better call at our house, if you are going that way, 24 Mews Street, Grosvenor Square. My father's got a slight touch of the gout, and is kept at home by it." The misguided young barnacle, evidently going blind on his eye-glass side, but ashamed to make any further alteration in his painful arrangements. "Thank you. I will call there now. Good morning." Young Barnacle seemed discomfited at this, as not having at all expected him to go. "You are quite sure?" said Barnacle junior, calling after him when he got to the door, unwilling wholly to relinquish the bright business idea he had conceived. "That it's nothing about tonnage?" "Quite sure." With such assurance, and rather wondering what might have taken place if it had been anything about tonnage, Mr. Clennam withdrew to pursue his inquiries. Mews Street, Grosvenor Square, was not absolutely Grosvenor Square itself, but it was very near it. It was a hideous little street of dead wall, stables, and dunghills, with lofts over coach-houses, inhabited by coachmen's families, who had a passion for drying clothes and decorating their window-sills with miniature turnpike gates. The principal chimney-sweep of that fashionable quarter lived at the blind end of Mews Street, and the same corner contained an establishment much frequented about early morning and twilight for the purchase of wine bottles and kitchen stuff. Punch's shows used to lean against the dead wall in Mews Street, while their proprietors were dining elsewhere, and the dogs of the neighbourhood made appointments to meet in the same locality. Yet there were 2 or 3 small airless houses at the entrance end of Mews Street, which went at enormous rents on account of their being abject hangers-on to a fashionable situation, and whenever one of these fearful little coops was to be let, which seldom happened, for they were in great request, the house agent advertised it as a gentlemanly residence in the most aristocratic part of town, inhabited solely by the elite of the beau monde. If a gentlemanly residence coming strictly within this narrow margin had not been essential to the blood of the Barnacles, this particular branch would have had a pretty wide selection among, let us say, 10,000 houses, offering 50 times the accommodation for a third of the money. As it was, Mr. Barnacle, finding his gentlemanly residence extremely inconvenient and extremely dear, always laid it, as a public servant, at the door of the country, and adduced it as another instance of the country's parsimony. Arthur Clennam came to a squeezed house, with a ramshackle bowed front, little dingy windows, and a little dark area like a damp waistcoat pocket, which he found to be number 24, Mews Street, Grosvenor Square. To the sense of smell the house was like a sort of bottle filled with a strong distillation of mews, and when the footman opened the door, he seemed to take the stopper out. The footman was to the Grosvenor Square footmen what the house was to the Grosvenor Square houses. Admirable in his way was a back and a byway. His gorgeousness was not unmixed with dirt, and both in complexion and consistency he had suffered from the closeness of his pantry. A sallow flabbiness was upon him when he took the stopper out, and presented the bottle to Mr. Clennam's nose. "Be so good as to give that card to Mr. Tite Barnacle, and to say that I have just now seen the younger Mr. Barnacle, who recommended me to call here." The footman, who had as many large buttons with the Barnacle crest upon them on the flaps of his pockets, as if he were the family strong-box, and carried the plate and jewels about with him buttoned up, pondered over the card a little, then said, "Walk in." It required some judgment to do it without butting the inner hall door open, and in the consequent mental confusion and physical darkness slipping down the kitchen stairs. The visitor, however, brought himself up safely on the door-mat. Still the footman said, "Walk in," so the visitor followed him. At the inner hall door, another bottle seemed to be presented, and another stopper taken out. This second vial appeared to be filled with concentrated provisions and extract of zinc from the pantry. After a skirmish in the narrow passage, occasioned by the footman's opening the door of the dismal dining-room with confidence, finding someone there with consternation, and backing on the visitor with disorder, the visitor was shut up, pending his announcement, in a close back parlour. There he had an opportunity of refreshing himself with both the bottles at once, looking out at a low, blinding wall 3 feet off, and speculating on the number of barnacle families within the bills of mortality, who lived in such hutches of their own free flunky choice. Mr. Barnacle would see him. Would he walk upstairs? He would, and he did. And in the drawing-room, with his leg on a rest, he found Mr. Barnacle himself, the express image and presentment of how not to do it. Mr. Barnacle dated from a better time, when the country was not so parsimonious and the Circumlocution Office was not so badgered. He wound and wound folds of white cravat round his neck, as he wound and wound folds of tape and paper round the neck of the country. His wristbands and collar were oppressive. His voice and manner were oppressive. He had a large watch-chain and bunch of seals, a coat buttoned up to inconvenience, a waistcoat buttoned up to inconvenience, an unwrinkled pair of trousers, a stiff pair of boots. He was altogether splendid, massive, overpowering, and impracticable. He seemed to have been sitting for his portrait to Sir Thomas Lawrence all the days of his life.
"Mr. Clennam," said Mr. Barnacle, "be seated."
Mr. Clennam became seated.
"You have called on me, I believe," said Mr. Barnacle, "at the Circumlocution," giving it the air of a word of about 25 syllables, "office." "I have taken that liberty." Mr. Barnacle solemnly bent his head as who would say, "I do not deny that it is a liberty. Proceed to take another liberty, and let me know your business." "Allow me to observe that I have been for some years in China, am quite a stranger at home, and have no personal motive or interest in the inquiry I am about to make." Mr. Barnacle tapped his fingers on the table, and, as if he were now sitting for his portrait to a new and strange artist, appeared to say to his visitor, "If you will be good enough to take me with my present lofty expression, I shall feel obliged." "I have found a debtor in the Marshalsea prison of the name of Dorrit, who has been there many years. I wish to investigate his confused affairs so far as to ascertain whether it may not be possible, after this lapse of time, to ameliorate his unhappy condition. The name of Mr. Tite Barnacle has been mentioned to me as representing some highly influential interest among his creditors. Am I correctly informed?" It being one of the principles of the Circumlocution Office never, on any account whatever, to give a straightforward answer, Mr. Barnacle said, "Possibly." "On behalf of the Crown, may I ask, or as private individual?" "The Circumlocution Department, sir," Mr. Barnacle replied, "may have possibly recommended, possibly, I cannot say, that some public claim against the insolvent estate of a firm or co-partnership to which this person may have belonged should be enforced. The question may have been, in the course of official business, referred to the Circumlocution Department for its consideration. The department may have either originated or confirmed a minute making that recommendation."
"I assume this to be the case, then?"
"The Circumlocution Department," said Mr. Barnacle, "is not responsible for any gentleman's assumptions."
"May I inquire how I can obtain official information as to the real state of the case?"
"It is competent," said Mr. Barnacle, "to any member of the public," mentioning that obscure body with reluctance, as his natural enemy, "to memorialize the Circumlocution Department. Such formalities as are required to be observed in so doing may be known on application to the proper branch of that department."
"Which is the proper branch?"
"I must refer you," returned Mr. Barnacle, ringing the bell, "to the department itself for a formal answer to that inquiry."
"Excuse my mentioning—"
"The department is accessible to the public."
Mr. Barnacle was always checked a little by that word of impertinent signification.
"If the public approaches it according to the official forms. If the public does not approach it according to the official forms, the public has itself to blame."
Mr. Barnacle made him a severe bow, as a wounded man of family, a wounded man of place, and a wounded man of a gentlemanly residence, all rolled into one. And he made Mr. Barnacle a bow, and was shut out into Mew Street by the flabby footman. Having got to this pass, he resolved, as an exercise in perseverance, to betake himself again to the Circumlocution Office, and try what satisfaction he could get there. So he went back to the Circumlocution Office, and once more sent up his card to Barnacle Junior by a messenger who took it very ill indeed that he should come back again, and who was eating mashed potatoes and gravy behind a partition by the hall fire. He was readmitted to the presence of Barnacle Junior, and found that young gentleman singeing his knees now, and gaping his weary way on to 4 o'clock.
"I say, look here, you stick to us in a devil of a manner," said Barnacle Junior, looking over his shoulder.
"I want to know—"
"Look here, upon my soul, you mustn't come into the place saying you want to know, you know,"
remonstrated Barnacle Junior, turning about and putting up the eyeglass. "I want to know," said Arthur Clennam, who had made up his mind to persistence in one short form of words, "the precise nature of the claim of the Crown against a prisoner for debt named Dorrit."
"I say, look here, you really are going it at a great pace, you know. Egad, you haven't got an appointment,"
said Barnacle Junior, as if the thing were growing serious. "I want to know," said Arthur, and repeated his case. Barnacle Junior stared at him until his eyeglass fell out, and then put it in again and stared at him until it fell out again.
"You have no right to come this sort of move," he then observed with the greatest weakness. "Look here, what do you mean? You told me you didn't know whether it was public business or not."
"I have now ascertained that it is public business," returned the suitor, "and I want to know," and again repeated his monotonous inquiry. Its effect upon young Barnacle was to make him repeat in a defenceless way, "Look here, upon my soul, you mustn't come into the place saying you want to know, you know." The effect of that upon Arthur Clennam was to make him repeat his inquiry in exactly the same words and tone as before. The effect of that upon young Barnacle was to make him a wonderful spectacle of failure and helplessness.
"Well, I tell you what, look here, you had better try the secretarial department," he said at last, sidling to the bell and ringing it. "Jenkinson?"
to the mashed potatoes messenger.
"Mr. Wobbler?"
Arthur Clennam, who now felt that he had devoted himself to the storming of the Circumlocution Office, and must go through with it, accompanied the messenger to another floor of the building, where the functionary pointed out Mr. Wobbler's room. He entered that apartment, and found two gentlemen sitting face to face at a large and easy desk, one of whom was polishing a gun-barrel on his pocket-handkerchief, while the other was spreading marmalade on bread with a paper knife. "Mr. Wobbler?" inquired the suitor. Both gentlemen glanced at him, and seemed surprised at his assurance.
"So he went,"
said the gentleman with the gun-barrel, who was an extremely deliberate speaker,
"down to his cousin's place, and took the dog with him by rail. Inestimable dog, flew at the porter fellow when he was put into the dog-box, and flew at the guard when he was taken out. He got 6 fellows into a barn, and a good supply of rats, and timed the dog. Finding the dog able to do it immensely, made the match, and heavily backed the dog. When the match came off,
some devil of a fellow was bought over, sir. Dog was made drunk. Dog's master was cleaned out." "Mr. Wobbler?" inquired the suitor. The gentleman who was spreading the marmalade returned, without looking up from that occupation. "What did he call the dog?" "Called him lovely," said the other gentleman. "Said the dog was the perfect picture of the old aunt from whom he had expectations. Found him particularly like her when hocussed." "Mr. Wobbler," said the suitor. Both gentlemen laughed for some time, the gentleman with the gun barrel considering it, on inspection in a satisfactory state, referred it to the other. Receiving confirmation of his views, he fitted it into its place in the case before him, and took out the stock and polished that, softly whistling. "Mr. Wobbler," said the suitor.
"What's the matter?"
Then said Mr. Wobbler with his mouth full. "I want to know," said Arthur Clennam, again mechanically set forth what he wanted to know.
"Can't inform you,"
observed Mr. Wobbler, apparently to his lunch.
"Never heard of it. Nothing at all to do with it. Better try Mr. Clive, second door on the left in the next passage."
"Perhaps he will give me the same answer."
"Very likely. Don't know anything about it,"
said Mr. Wobbler. The suitor turned away and had left the room, when the gentleman with the gun called out, "Mister! Hello!" He looked in again.
"Shut the door after you. You're letting in a devil of a draught here."
A few steps brought him to the second door on the left in the next passage. In that room he found 3 gentlemen, number 1 doing nothing particular, number 2 doing nothing particular, number 3 doing nothing particular. They seemed, however, to be more directly concerned than the others had been in the effective execution of the great principle of the office, as there was an awful inner apartment with a double door, in which the circumlocution sages appeared to be assembled in council, and out of which there was an imposing coming of papers, and into which there was an imposing going of papers, almost constantly, wherein another gentleman, number 4, was the active instrument. "I want to know," said Arthur Clennam, and again stated his case in the same barrel-organ way. As number 1 referred him to number 2, and as number 2 referred him to number 3, he had occasion to state it 3 times before they all referred him to number 4, to whom he stated it again. Number 4 was a vivacious, well-looking, well-dressed, agreeable young fellow. He was a barnacle, but on the more sprightly side of the family, and he said in an easy way, "Oh, you had better not bother yourself about it, I think." "Not bother myself about it? No, I recommend you not to bother yourself about it." This was such a new point of view that Arthur Clennam found himself at a loss how to receive it. "You can, if you like. I can give you plenty of forms to fill up, lots of them here. You can have a dozen if you like, but you'll never go on with it," said number 4. "Would it be such hopeless work? Excuse me, I am a stranger in England." "I don't say it would be hopeless," returned number 4 with a frank smile. "I don't express an opinion about that. I only express an opinion about you. I don't think you'd go on with it. However, of course, you can do as you like. I suppose there was a failure in the performance of a contract, or something of that kind, was there?" "I really don't know." "Well, that you can find out. Then you'll find out what department the contract was in, and then you'll find out all about it there." "I beg your pardon, how shall I find out?" "Why, you'll ask till they tell you. Then you'll memorialize that department, according to regular forms which you'll find out, for leave to memorialize this department. If you get it, which you may after a time, that memorial must be entered in that department, sent to be registered in this department, sent back to be signed by that department, sent back to be countersigned by this department, and then it will begin to be regularly before that department. You'll find out when the business passes through each of these stages by asking at both departments till they tell you." "But surely this is not the way to do the business." Arthur Clennam could not help saying. This airy young barnacle was quite entertained by his simplicity in supposing for a moment that it was. This light-in-hand young barnacle knew perfectly that it was not. This touch-and-go young barnacle had got up the department in a private secretaryship, that he might be ready for any little bit of fat that came to hand, and he fully understood the department to be a politico-diplomatic hocus-pocus piece of machinery for the assistance of the nobs in keeping off the snobs. This dashing young barnacle, in a word, was likely to become a statesman, and to make a figure. When the business is regularly before that department, whatever it is, pursued this bright young barnacle, then you can watch it from time to time through that department. When it comes regularly before this department, then you must watch it from time to time through this department. We shall have to refer it right and left, and when we refer it anywhere, then you have to look it up. When it comes back to us at any time, then you had better look us up. When it sticks anywhere, you'll have to try to give it a jog. When you write to another department about it, and then to this department about it, and don't hear anything satisfactory about it, why, then you had better keep on writing. Arthur Clennam looked very doubtful indeed. "But I am obliged to you at any rate," said he, "for your politeness." "Not at all," replied this engaging young barnacle. "Try the thing and see how you like it. It will be in your power to give it up at any time if you don't like it. You had better take a lot of forms away with you. Give him a lot of forms." With which instruction to number 2, this sparkling young barnacle took a fresh handful of papers from numbers 1 and 3, and carried them into the sanctuary to offer to the presiding idol of the Circumlocution Office. Arthur Clennam put his forms in his pocket gloomily enough, and went his way down the long stone passage and the long stone staircase. He had come to the swing doors leading into the street, and was waiting, not over-patiently, for 2 people who were between him and them to pass out and let him follow, when the voice of one of them struck familiarly on his ear. He looked at the speaker and recognized Mr. Meagles. Mr. Meagles was very red in the face, redder than travel could have made him, and collaring a short man who was with him, said, "Come out, you rascal, come out!" It was such an unexpected hearing, and it was also such an unexpected sight to see Mr. Meagles burst the swing doors open, and emerge into the street with a short man, who was of an unoffending appearance, that Clennam stood still for the moment, exchanging looks of surprise with the porter. He followed, however, quickly, and saw Mr. Meagles going down the street with his enemy at his side. He soon came up with his old travelling companion, and touched him on the back. The choleric face which Mr. Meagles turned upon him smoothed when he saw who it was, and he put out his friendly hand. "How are you?" said Mr. Meagles. "How d'ye do? I have only just come over from abroad. I am glad to see you." "And I am rejoiced to see you. Thank ye, thank ye." "Mrs. Meagles and your daughter are as well as possible," said Mr. Meagles. "I only wish you had come upon me in a more prepossessing condition as to coolness." Though it was anything but a hot day, Mr. Meagles was in a heated state that attracted the attention of the passers-by, more particularly as he leaned his back against the railing, took off his hat and cravat, and heartily rubbed his steaming head and face, and his reddened ears and neck, without the least regard for public opinion. "Phew!" said Mr. Meagles, dressing again. "That's comfortable. Now I am a cooler." "You have been ruffled, Mr. Meagles. What is the matter?" "Wait a bit and I'll tell you. Have you leisure for a turn in the park?" "As much as you please." "Come along, then. You may well look at him." He happened to have turned his eyes towards the offender, whom Mr. Meagles had so angrily collared. "He's something to look at, that fellow is." He was not much to look at, either in point of size or in point of dress, being merely a short, square, practical-looking man, whose hair had turned grey, and in whose face and forehead there were deep lines of cogitation, which looked as though they were carved in hard wood. He was dressed in decent black, a little rusty, and had the appearance of a sagacious master in some handicraft. He had a spectacle case in his hand, which he turned over and over while he was thus in question, with a certain free use of the thumb that is never seen but in a hand accustomed to tools.
"You keep with us,"
said Mr. Meagles in a threatening kind of way,
"and I'll introduce you presently. Now then."
Clennam wondered within himself, as they took the nearest way to the park, what this unknown, who complied in the gentlest manner, could have been doing. His appearance did not at all justify the suspicion that he had been detected in designs on Mr. Meagles's pocket-handkerchief, nor had he any appearance of being quarrelsome or violent. He was a quiet, plain, steady man, made no attempt to escape, and seemed a little depressed, but neither ashamed nor repentant. If he were a criminal offender, he must surely be an incorrigible hypocrite, and if he were no offender, why should Mr. Meagles have collared him in the Circumlocution Office? He perceived that the man was not a difficulty in his own mind alone, but in Mr. Meagles's too, for such conversation as they had together on the short way to the park was by no means well sustained, and Mr. Meagles's eye always wandered back to the man, even when he spoke of something very different. At length, they being among the trees, Mr. Meagles stopped short and said,
"Mr. Clennam, will you do me the favour to look at this man? His name is Doyce, Daniel Doyce. You wouldn't suppose this man to be a notorious rascal, would you?"
"I certainly should not." It was really a disconcerting question with the man there.
"No, you would not. I know you would not. You wouldn't suppose him to be a public offender, would you?"
"No."
"No, but he is. He is a public offender. What has he been guilty of? Murder, manslaughter, arson, forgery, swindling, house-breaking, highway robbery, larceny, conspiracy, fraud. Which should you say now?"
"I should say," returned Arthur Clennam, observing a faint smile in Daniel Doyce's face, "not one of them."
"You are right," said Mr. Meagles, "but he has been ingenious, and he has been trying to turn his ingenuity to his country's service. That makes him a public offender directly, sir."
Arthur looked at the man himself, who only shook his head.
"This Doyce," said Mr. Meagles, "is a smith and engineer. He is not in a large way, but he is well known as a very ingenious man. A dozen years ago he perfects an invention involving a very curious secret process, of great importance to his country and his fellow creatures. I won't say how much money it cost him, or how many years of his life he had been about it, but he brought it to perfection a dozen years ago. Or wasn't it a dozen?" said Mr. Meagles, addressing Doyce. "He is the most exasperating man in the world. He never complains."
"Yes, rather better than 12 years ago."
"Rather better?" said Mr. Meagles. "You mean rather worse. Well, Mr. Clennam, he addresses himself to the government. The moment he addresses himself to the government, he becomes a public offender. Sir," said Mr. Meagles, in danger of making himself excessively hot again, "he ceases to be an innocent citizen and becomes a culprit. He is treated from that instant as a man who has done some infernal action. He is a man to be shirked, put off, browbeaten, sneered at, handed over by this highly connected young or old gentleman to that highly connected young or old gentleman, and dodged back again. He is a man with no rights in his own time or his own property, a mere outlaw whom it is justifiable to get rid of anyhow, a man to be worn out by all possible means."
It was not so difficult to believe, after the morning's experience, as Mr. Meagles supposed.
"Don't stand there, Doyce, turning your spectacle case over and over," cried Mr. Meagles, "but tell Mr. Clennam what you confess to me."
"I undoubtedly was made to feel," said the inventor, "as if I had committed an offence. In dancing attendance at the various offices, I was always treated, more or less, as if it was a very bad offence. I have frequently found it necessary to reflect, for my own self-support, that I really had not done anything to bring myself into the Newgate calendar, but only wanted to effect a great saving and a great improvement."
"There!" said Mr. Meagles. "Judge whether I exaggerate. Now you'll be able to believe me when I tell you the rest of the case."
With this prelude, Mr. Meagles went through the narrative, the established narrative which has become tiresome, the matter-of-course narrative which we all know by heart. How, after interminable attendance and correspondence, after infinite impertinences, ignorances, and insults, my lords made a minute, number 3472, allowing the culprit to make certain trials of his invention at his own expense. How the trials were made in the presence of a board of 6, of whom 2 ancient members were too blind to see it, 2 other ancient members were too deaf to hear it, 1 other ancient member was too lame to get near it, and the final ancient member was too pig-headed to look at it. How there were more ears, more impertinences, ignorances, and insults. How my lords then made a minute, number 5103, whereby they resigned the business to the Circumlocution Office. How the Circumlocution Office, in course of time, took up the business as if it were a brand-new thing of yesterday, which had never been heard of before, muddled the business, addled the business, tossed the business in a wet blanket. How the impertinences, ignorances, and insults went through the multiplication table. How there was a reference of the invention to 3 barnacles and a still-stalking who knew nothing about it, into whose heads nothing could be hammered about it, who got bored about it, and reported physical impossibilities about it. How the Circumlocution Office, in a minute, number 8740, saw no reason to reverse the decision at which my lords had arrived. How the Circumlocution Office, being reminded that my lords had arrived at no decision, shelved the business. How there had been a final interview with the head of the Circumlocution Office that very morning, and how the brazen head had spoken, and had been, upon the whole, and under all the circumstances, and looking at it from the various points of view, of opinion that one of 2 courses was to be pursued in respect of the business, that was to say, either to leave it alone for evermore, or to begin it all over again. Upon which, said Mr. Meagles, as a practical man, I then and there, in that presence, took Dorrit by the collar, and told him it was plain to me that he was an infamous rascal and treasonable disturber of the government peace, and took him away. I brought him out of the office door by the collar, that the very porter might know I was a practical man who appreciated the official estimate of such characters, and here we are. If that airy young barnacle had been there, he would have frankly told them perhaps that the Circumlocution Office had achieved its function, that what the barnacles had to do was to stick on to the national ship as long as they could, that to trim the ship, lighten the ship, clean the ship, would be to knock them off, that they could but be knocked off once, and that if the ship went down with them yet sticking to it, that was the ship's look-out, not theirs.
"There," said Mr. Meagles, "now you know all about Dorrit, except, which I own does not improve my state of mind, that even now you don't hear him complain."
"You must have great patience," said Arthur Clennam, looking at him with some wonder, "great forbearance." "No," he returned, "I don't know that I have more than another man."
"By the Lord, you have more than I have, though!" cried Mr. Meagles.
Dorrit smiled, as he said to Clennam, "You see, my experience of these things does not begin with myself. It has been in my way to know a little about them from time to time. Mine is not a particular case. I am not worse used than 100 others who have put themselves in the same position, than all the others I was going to say. I don't know that I should find that a consolation if it were my case, but I am very glad that you do. Understand me, I don't say," he replied in his steady, planning way, and looking into the distance before him as if his grey eye were measuring it, "that it's recompense for a man's toil and hope, but it's a certain sort of relief to know that I might have counted on this." He spoke in that quiet, deliberate manner and in that undertone which is often observable in mechanics who consider and adjust with great nicety. It belonged to him like his suppleness of thumb, or his peculiar way of tilting up his hat at the back every now and then, as if he were contemplating some half-finished work of his hand and thinking about it. "Disappointed?" he went on as he walked between them under the trees. "Yes, no doubt I am disappointed. Hurt? Yes, no doubt I am hurt. That's only natural. But what I mean when I say that people who put themselves in the same position are mostly used in the same way—" "In England," said Mr. Meagles. "Oh, of course I mean in England. When they take their inventions into foreign countries, that's quite different, and that's the reason why so many go there." Mr. Meagles very hot indeed again. "What I mean is that however this comes to be the regular way of our government, it is its regular way. Have you ever heard of any projector or inventor who failed to find it all but inaccessible, and whom it did not discourage and ill-treat?" "I cannot say that I ever have." "Have you ever known it to be beforehand in the adoption of any useful thing? Ever known it to set an example of any useful kind?"
"I am a good deal older than my friend here," said Mr. Meagles, "and I'll answer that, never."
"But we all three have known, I expect," said the inventor, "a pretty many cases of its fixed determination to be miles upon miles and years upon years behind the rest of us, and of its being found out persisting in the use of things long superseded, and after the better things were well known and generally taken up." They all agreed upon that. "Well then," said Doris with a sigh, "as I know what such a metal will do at such a temperature, and such a body under such a pressure, so I may know, if I will only consider, how these great lords and gentlemen will certainly deal with such a matter as mine. I have no right to be surprised, with a head upon my shoulders and memory in it, that I fall into the ranks with all who came before me. I ought to have let it alone. I have had warning enough, I am sure." With that he put up his spectacle case and said to Arthur, "If I don't complain, Mr. Clennam, I can feel gratitude, and I assure you that I feel it towards our mutual friend. Many is the day, and many is the way in which he has backed me."
"Stuff and nonsense,"
said Mr. Meagles. Arthur could not but glance at Daniel Doyce in the ensuing silence. Though it was evidently in the grain of his character, and of his respect for his own case, that he should abstain from idle murmuring, it was evident that he had grown the older, the sterner, and the poorer for his long endeavour. He could not but think what a blessed thing it would have been for this man if he had taken a lesson from the gentleman who was so kind as to take a nation's affairs in charge, and had learned how not to do it. Mr. Meagles was hot and despondent for about 5 minutes, and then began to cool and clear up.
"Come, come," said he, "we shall not make this the better by being grim. Where do you think of going, Dan?"
"I shall go back to the factory," said Dan.
"Why, then, we'll all go back to the factory or walk in that direction," returned Mr. Meagles cheerfully. "Mr. Clennam won't be deterred by its being in Bleeding Heart Yard."
"Bleeding Heart Yard?" said Clennam. "I want to go there."
"So much the better,"
cried Mr. Meagles.
"Come along."
As they went along, certainly one of the party, and probably more than one, thought that Bleeding Heart Yard was no inappropriate destination for a man who had been in official correspondence with my lords and the Barnacles, and perhaps had a misgiving also that Britannia herself might come to look for lodgings in Bleeding Heart Yard some ugly day or other, if she overdid the circumlocution office. End of chapter the 10th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 11th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st, chapter the 11th. Let loose. A late, dull autumn night was closing in upon the river Saone. The stream, like a sullied-looking glass in a gloomy place, reflected the clouds heavily, and the low banks leaned over here and there, as if they were half curious and half afraid to see their darkening pictures in the water. The flat expanse of country about Chalons lay a long heavy streak, occasionally made a little ragged by a row of poplar trees against the wrathful sunset. On the banks of the river Saone it was wet, depressing, solitary, and the night deepened fast. One man slowly moving on towards Chalons was the only visible figure in the landscape. Cain might have looked as lonely and avoided. With an old sheepskin knapsack at his back, and a rough unbarked stick cut out of some wood in his hand, miry, footsore, his shoes and gaiters trodden out, his hair and beard untrimmed, the cloak he carried over his shoulder, and the clothes he wore, sodden with wet, limping along in pain and difficulty, he looked as if the clouds were hurrying from him, as if the wail of the wind and the shuddering of the grass were directed against him, as if the low mysterious plashing of the water murmured at him, as if the fitful autumn night were disturbed by him. He glanced here, and he glanced there, sullenly but shrinkingly, and sometimes stopped and turned about, and looked all round him. Then he limped on again, toiling and muttering, "To the devil with this plain that has no end! To the devil with these stones that cut like knives! To the devil with this dismal darkness wrapping itself about one with a chill! I hate you!" And he would have visited his hatred upon it all with the scowl he threw about him, if he could. He trudged a little further, and looking into the distance before him, stopped again. "I, hungry, thirsty, weary. You imbeciles, where the lights are yonder, eating and drinking, and warming yourselves at fires. I wish I had the sacking of your town. I would repay you, my children." But the teeth he set at the town, and the hand he shook at the town, brought the town no nearer. And the man was yet hungrier, and thirstier, and wearier, when his feet were on its jagged pavement, and he stood looking about him. There was the hotel with its gateway, and its savoury smell of cooking. There was the cafe with its bright windows, and its rattling of dominoes. There was the dyer's with its strips of red cloth on the door-posts. There was the silversmith's with its earrings and its offerings for altars. There was the tobacco dealer's with its lively group of soldier customers coming out pipe in mouth. There were the bad odours of the town, and the rain and the refuse in the kennels, and the faint lamps slung across the road, and the huge diligence, and its mountain of luggage, and its 6 grey horses with their tails tied up, getting under way at the coach-office. But no small cabaret for a straitened traveller being within sight, he had to seek one round the dark corner, where the cabbage leaves lay thickest, trodden about the public cistern, at which women had not yet left off drawing water. There, in the back street, he found one, the break of day. The curtained windows clouded the break of day, but it seemed light and warm, and it announced in legible inscriptions, with appropriate pictorial embellishment of billiard, cue, and ball, that at the break of day one could play billiards; that there one could find meat, drink, and lodgings, whether one came on horseback or came on foot; and that it kept good wines, liqueurs, and brandy. The man turned the handle of the break of day door, and limped in. He touched his discoloured slouched hat, as he came in at the door, to a few men who occupied the room. 2 were playing dominoes at one of the little tables. 3 or 4 were seated round the stove, conversing as they smoked. The billiard table in the centre was left alone for the time. The landlady of the Daybreak sat behind her little counter among her cloudy bottles of syrups, baskets of cakes, and leaden drainage for glasses, working at her needle. Making his way to an empty little table in a corner of the room behind the stove, he put down his knapsack and his cloak upon the ground. As he raised his head from stooping to do so, he found the landlady beside him.
"One can lodge here tonight, madame?"
"Perfectly," said the landlady in a high, sing-song, cheery voice.
"Good. One can dine, sup, what you please to call it?"
"Ah, perfectly," cried the landlady as before.
"Dispatch then, madame, if you please, something to eat as quickly as you can, and some wine at once. I am exhausted."
"It is very bad weather, monsieur," said the landlady.
"Cursed weather."
"And a very long road."
"A cursed road." His hoarse voice failed him, and he rested his head upon his hands until a bottle of wine was brought from the counter. Having filled and emptied his little tumbler twice, and having broken off an end from the great loaf that was set before him with his cloth and napkin, soup plate, salt, pepper, and oil, he rested his back against the corner of the wall, made a couch of the bench on which he sat, and began to chew crust, until such time as his repast should be ready. There had been that momentary interruption of the talk above the stove, and that temporary inattention to and distraction from one another, which is usually inseparable in such a company from the arrival of a stranger. It had passed over by this time, and the men had done glancing at him, and were talking again. "That's the true reason," said one of them, bringing a story he had been telling to a close. "That's the true reason why they said that the devil was let loose." The speaker was the tall Swiss belonging to the church, and he brought something of the authority of the church into the discussion, especially as the devil was in question. The landlady, having given her directions for the new guest's entertainment to her husband, who acted as cook to the break of day, had resumed her needlework behind her counter. She was a smart, neat, bright little woman, with a good deal of cap and a good deal of stocking, and she struck into the conversation with several laughing nods of her head, but without looking up from her work. "Oh, heaven, then!" said she. "When the boat came up from Lyons and brought the news that the devil was actually let loose at Marseilles, some fly-catchers swallowed it. But I? No, not I." "Madame, you're always right," returned the tall Swiss. "Doubtless you were enraged against that man, madame."
"Ah, yes, then," cried the landlady, raising her eyes from her work, opening them very wide, and tossing her head on the side. "Naturally, yes. He was a bad subject." "He was a wicked wretch," said the landlady, "and well merited what he had the good fortune to escape. So much the worse."
"Stay, madame, let us see," returned the Swiss, argumentatively turning his cigar between his lips. "It may have been his unfortunate destiny. He may have been the child of circumstances. It is always possible that he had, and has, good in him, if one did but know how to find it out. Philosophical philanthropy teaches—" The rest of the little knot about the stove murmured an objection to the introduction of that threatening expression. Even the two players at dominoes glanced up from their game, as if to protest against philosophical philanthropy being brought by name into the break of day. "Hold there, you and your philanthropy!" cried the smiling landlady, nodding her head more than ever. "Listen, then. I am a woman, I know nothing of philosophical philanthropy, but I know what I have seen, and what I have looked in the face in this world here, where I find myself. And I tell you this, my friend, that there are people, men and women both, unfortunately, who have no good in them, none. That there are people whom it is necessary to detest without compromise. That there are people who must be dealt with as enemies of the human race. That there are people who have no human heart, and who must be crushed like savage beasts and cleared out of the way. They are but few, I hope, but I have seen, in this world here where I find myself, and even at the little break of day, that there are such people, and I do not doubt that this man, whatever they call him, I forget his name, is one of them." The landlady's lively speech was received with greater favour at the break of day
than it would have elicited from certain amiable whitewashers of the class she so unreasonably objected to, nearer Great Britain. "My faith, if your philosophical philanthropy," said the landlady, putting down her work and rising to take the stranger's soup from her husband, who appeared with it at the side door, "puts anybody at the mercy of such people by holding terms with them at all, in words or deeds, or both, take it away from the break of day, for it isn't worth a sou." As she placed the soup before the guest, who changed his attitude to a sitting one, he looked her full in the face, and his moustache went up under his nose, and his nose came down over his moustache. "Well," said the previous speaker, "let us come back to our subject. Leaving all that aside, gentlemen, it was because the man was acquitted on his trial that people said at Marseilles that the devil was let loose. That was how the phrase began to circulate, and what it meant. Nothing more." "How do they call him?" said the landlady. "Bureau, is it not?" "Rigaud, madame," returned the tall Swiss. "Rigaud, to be sure." The traveller's soup was succeeded by a dish of meat, and that by a dish of vegetables. He ate all that was placed before him, emptied his bottle of wine, called for a glass of rum, and smoked his cigarette with his cup of coffee. As he became refreshed, he became overbearing, and patronized the company at the daybreak in certain small talk, at which he assisted, as if his condition were far above his appearance. The company might have had other engagements, or they might have felt their inferiority, but in any case they dispersed by degrees, and not being replaced by other company, left their new patron in possession of the break of day. The landlord was clinking about in his kitchen, the landlady was quiet at her work, and the refreshed traveller sat smoking by the stove, warming his ragged feet. "Pardon me, madame, that bureau, Rigaud, monsieur, Rigaud, pardon me again, has contracted your displeasure. How?" The landlady, who had been at one moment thinking within herself that this was a handsome man, at another moment that this was an ill-looking man, observed the nose coming down and the moustache going up, and strongly inclined to the latter decision. Rigaud was a criminal, she said, who had killed his wife. "Ay, ay, death of my life, that's a criminal indeed. But how do you know it?" "All the world knows it." "Aha! And yet he escaped justice." "Monsieur, the law could not prove it against him to its satisfaction. So the law says. Nevertheless, all the world knows he did it. The people knew it so well that they tried to tear him to pieces." "Being all in perfect accord with their own wives," said the guest. "Ha, ha!" The landlady of the break of day looked at him again, and felt almost confirmed in her last decision. He had a fine hand, though, and he turned it with a great show. She began once more to think that he was not ill-looking after all. "Did you mention, madame, or was it mentioned among the gentlemen, what became of him?" The landlady shook her head, it being the first conversational stage at which her vivacious earnestness had ceased to nod it, keeping time to what she said. It had been mentioned at the daybreak, she remarked, on the authority of the journals, that he had been kept in prison for his own safety. However that might be, he had escaped his deserts. So much the worse. The guest sat looking at her as he smoked out his final cigarette, and as she sat with her head bent over her work, with an expression that might have resolved her doubts, and brought her to a lasting conclusion on the subject of his good or bad looks if she had seen it. When she did look up, the expression was not there. The hand was smoothing his shaggy moustache. "May one ask to be shown to bed, madame?" "Very willingly, monsieur." "Hola, my husband!" My husband would conduct him upstairs. There was one traveller there, asleep, who had gone to bed very early indeed, being overpowered by fatigue. But it was a large chamber with 2 beds in it, and space enough for 20. This the landlady of the break of day chirpingly explained, calling between whiles, "Hola, my husband!" out at the side door. My husband answered at length, "It is I, my wife," and presenting himself in his cook's cap, lighted the traveller up a steep and narrow staircase, the traveller carrying his own cloak and knapsack, and bidding the landlady good night with a complimentary reference to the pleasure of seeing her again to-morrow. It was a large room, with a rough splintery floor, unplastered rafters overhead, and 2 bedsteads on opposite sides. Here my husband put down the candle he carried, and with a sidelong look at his guest stooping over his knapsack, gruffly gave him the instruction, "The bed to the right," and left him to his repose. The landlord, whether he was a good or a bad physiognomist, had fully made up his mind that the guest was an ill-looking fellow. The guest looked contemptuously at the clean, coarse bedding prepared for him, and sitting down on the rush chair at the bedside, drew his money out of his pocket, and told it over in his hand. "One must eat," he muttered to himself, "but by heaven I must eat at the cost of some other man to-morrow." As he sat pondering and mechanically weighing his money in his palm, the deep breathing of the traveller in the other bed fell so regularly upon his hearing that it attracted his eyes in that direction. The man was covered up warm, and had drawn the white curtain at his head, so that he could be only heard, not seen. But the deep, regular breathing, still going on while the other was taking off his worn shoes and gaiters, and still continuing when he had laid aside his coat and cravat, became at length a strong provocative to curiosity, and incentive to get a glimpse of the sleeper's face. The waking traveller, therefore, stole a little nearer, and yet a little nearer, and a little nearer to the sleeping traveller's bed, until he stood close beside it. Even then he could not see his face, for he had drawn the sheet over it. The regular breathing still continuing, he put his smooth white hand, such a treacherous hand it looked, as it went creeping from him to the sheet, and gently lifted it away. "Death of my soul!" he whispered, falling back. "Here's Cavaletto." The little Italian, previously influenced in his sleep perhaps by the stealthy presence at his bedside, stopped in his regular breathing, and with a long, deep respiration opened his eyes. At first they were not awake, though open. He lay for some seconds looking placidly at his old prison companion, and then, all at once, with a cry of surprise and alarm, sprang out of bed. "Hush! What's the matter? Keep quiet. It's I. You know me?" cried the other in a suppressed voice. But John Baptist, wildly staring, muttering a number of invocations and ejaculations, tremblingly backing into a corner, slipping on his trousers, and tying his coat by the 2 sleeves round his neck, manifested an unmistakable desire to escape by the door rather than renew the acquaintance. Seeing this, his old prison comrade fell back upon the door, and set his shoulders against it. "Cavaletto, wake, boy, rub your eyes and look at me. Not the name you used to call me, don't use that. Lanier, say Lanier." John Baptist, staring at him with eyes open to their utmost width, made a number of those national, back-handed shakes of the right forefinger in the air, as if he were resolved on negativing beforehand everything that the other could possibly advance during the whole term of his life. "Cavaletto, give me your hand. You know Lanier, the gentleman. Touch the hand of a gentleman." Submitting himself to the old tone of condescending authority, John Baptist, not at all steady on his legs as yet, advanced and put his hand in his patron's. Monsieur Lanier laughed, and having given it a squeeze, tossed it up and let it go. "Then you are," faltered John Baptist. "Not shaved? No, see here," cried Lanier, giving his head a twirl, "as tight on as your own." John Baptist, with a slight shiver, looked all round the room as if to recall where he was. His patron took that opportunity of turning the key in the door, and then sat down upon his bed. "Look," he said, holding up his shoes and gaiters. "That's a poor trim for a gentleman, you'll say. No matter, you shall see how soon I'll mend it. Come and sit down. Take your old place." John Baptist, looking anything but reassured, sat down on the floor at the bedside, keeping his eyes upon his patron all the time. "That's well," cried Lanier. "Now we might be in the old infernal hole again. Hey, how long have you been out?" "2 days after you, my master." "How do you come here?" "I was cautioned not to stay there, and so I left the town at once, and since then I have changed about. I have been doing odds and ends at Avignon, at Pont-Esprit, at Lyons, upon the Rhone, upon the Saône." As he spoke, he rapidly mapped the places out with his sunburnt hand upon the floor. "And where are you going?" "Going, my master?" "Aye." John Baptist seemed to desire to evade the question without knowing how. "By Bacchus!" he said at last, as if he were forced to the admission. "I have sometimes had a thought of going to Paris, and perhaps to England. Cavaletto, this is in confidence. I also am going to Paris, and perhaps to England. We'll go together." The little man nodded his head and showed his teeth, and yet seemed not quite convinced that it was a surpassingly desirable arrangement. "We'll go together," repeated Lanier. "You shall see how soon I will force myself to be recognized as a gentleman, and you shall profit by it. It is agreed? Are we one?" "Oh, surely, surely," said the little man. "Then you shall hear before I sleep, and in 6 words, for I won't sleep, how I appear before you, I, Lanier. Remember that, not the other." "Altro, not Before John Baptist could finish the name, his comrade had got his hand under his chin and fiercely shut up his mouth. "Death! What are you doing? Do you want me to be trampled upon and stoned? Do you want to be trampled upon and stoned? You would be. You don't imagine that they would set upon me and let my prison chum go? Don't think it." There was an expression in his face as he released his grip of his friend's jaw, from which his friend inferred that if the course of events really came to any stoning and trampling, Monsieur Lanier would so distinguish him with his notice as to ensure his having his full share of it. He remembered what a cosmopolitan gentleman Monsieur Lanier was, and how few weak distinctions he made. "I am a man," said Monsieur Lanier, "whom society has deeply wronged since you last saw me. You know that I am sensitive and brave, and that it is my character to govern. How has society respected those qualities in me? I have been shrieked at through the streets. I have been guarded through the streets against men, and especially women, running at me armed with any weapons they could lay their hands on. I have lain in prison for security, with the place of my confinement kept a secret, lest I should be torn out of it and felled by 100 blows. I have been carted out of Marseille in the dead of night, and carried leagues away from it packed in straw. It has not been safe for me to go near my house, and, with a beggar's pittance in my pocket, I have walked through vile mud and weather ever since, until my feet are crippled. Look at them. Such are the humiliations that society has inflicted upon me, possessing the qualities I have mentioned, and which you know me to possess. But society shall pay for it." All this he said in his companion's ear, and with his hand before his lips. "Even here," he went on in the same way, "even in this mean drinking shop, society pursues me. Madame defames me, and her guests defame me. I, too, a gentleman with manners and accomplishments, to strike them dead. But the wrongs society has heaped upon me are treasured in this breast." To all of which John Baptist, listening attentively to the suppressed hoarse voice, said from time to time, "Surely, surely," tossing his head and shutting his eyes, as if there were the clearest case against society that perfect candour could make out. "Put my shoes there," continued Lanier. "Hang my cloak to dry there by the door. Take my hat." He obeyed each instruction as it was given. "And this is the bed to which society consigns me, is it? Ha! Very well." As he stretched out his length upon it, with a ragged handkerchief bound round his wicked head, and only his wicked head showing above the bedclothes, John Baptist was rather strongly reminded of what had so very nearly happened to prevent the moustache from any more going up as it did, and the nose from any more coming down as it did. "Shaken out of Destiny's dice-box again into your company, eh? By heaven! So much the better for you. You'll profit by it. I shall need a long rest. Let me sleep in the morning." John Baptist replied that he should sleep as long as he would, and wishing him a happy night, put out the candle. One might have supposed that the next proceeding of the Italian would have been to undress, but he did exactly the reverse, and dressed himself from head to foot, saving his shoes. When he had so done, he lay down upon his bed with some of its coverings over him, and his coat still tied round his neck, to get through the night. When he started up, the godfather break of day was peeping at its namesake. He rose, took his shoes in his hand, turned the key in the door with great caution, and crept downstairs. Nothing was astir there but the smell of coffee, wine, tobacco, and syrups, and Madame's little counter looked ghastly enough. But he had paid Madame his little note at it overnight, and wanted to see nobody, wanted nothing but to get on his shoes and his knapsack, open the door, and run away. He prospered in his object. No movement or voice was heard when he opened the door. No wicked head tied up in a ragged handkerchief looked out of the upper window. When the sun had raised his full disk above the flat line of the horizon, and was striking fire out of the long muddy vista of paved road with its weary avenue of little trees, a black speck moved along the road, and splashed among the flaming pools of rain-water, which black speck was John Baptist Cavaletto, running away from his patron. End of chapter the 11th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 12th, book the 1st of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 12th. Bleeding Heart Yard. In London itself, though in the old rustic road towards a suburb of note, where in the days of William Shakespeare, author and stage player, there were royal hunting seats, howbeit no sport is left there now but for hunters of men, Bleeding Heart Yard was to be found. A place much changed in feature and in fortune, yet with some relish of ancient greatness about it. 2 or 3 mighty stacks of chimneys, and a few large dark rooms which had escaped being walled and subdivided out of the recognition of their old proportions, gave the yard a character. It was inhabited by poor people, who set up their rest among its faded glories, as Arabs of the desert pitch their tents among the fallen stones of the pyramids. But there was a family sentimental feeling prevalent in the yard, that it had a character. As if the aspiring city had become puffed up in the very ground on which it stood, the ground had so risen about Bleeding Heart Yard that you got into it down a flight of steps which formed no part of the original approach, and got out of it by a low gateway into a maze of shabby streets, which went about and about, tortuously ascending to the level again. At this end of the yard, and over the gateway, was the factory of Daniel Doyce, often heavily beating like a bleeding heart of iron, with the chink of metal upon metal. The opinion of the yard was divided respecting the derivation of its name. The more practical of its inmates abided by the tradition of a murder. The gentler and more imaginative inhabitants, including the whole of the tender sex, were loyal to the legend of a young lady of former times, closely imprisoned in her chamber by a cruel father, for remaining true to her own true love, and refusing to marry the suitor he chose for her. The legend related how that the young lady used to be seen up at her window behind the bars, murmuring a love-lorn song of which the burden was, bleeding heart, bleeding away, until she died. It was objected by the murderous party that this refrain was notoriously the invention of a tambour worker, a spinster and romantic, still lodging in the yard. But forasmuch as all favourite legends must be associated with the affections, and as many more people fall in love than commit murder, which it may be hoped, howsoever bad we are, will continue until the end of the world to be the dispensation under which we shall live, the bleeding heart, bleeding away story, carried the day by a great majority. Neither party would listen to the antiquaries who delivered learned lectures in the neighbourhood, showing the bleeding heart to have been the heraldic cognizance of the old family to whom the property had once belonged, and considering that the hour-glass they turned from ear to ear was filled with the earthiest and coarsest sand, the bleeding heart yarders had reason enough for objecting to be despoiled of the one little golden grain of poetry that sparkled in it. Down into the yard, by way of the steps, came Daniel Doyce, Mr. Meagles, and Clennam. Passing along the yard, and between the open doors on either hand, all abundantly garnished with light children nursing heavy ones, they arrived at its opposite boundary, the gateway. Here Arthur Clennam stopped to look about him for the domicile of Plornish, plasterer, whose name, according to the custom of Londoners, Daniel Doyce had never seen or heard of to that hour. It was plain enough, nevertheless, as little Dorrit had said, over a lime-splashed gateway in the corner, within which Plornish kept a ladder and a barrel or two. The last house in Bleeding Heart Yard, which she had described as his place of habitation, was a large house, let off to various tenants, but Plornish ingeniously hinted that he lived in the parlour, by means of a painted hand under his name, the forefinger of which hand, on which the artist had depicted a ring and a most elaborate nail of the genteelest form, referred all inquirers to that apartment. Parting from his companions, after arranging another meeting with Mr. Meagles, Clennam went alone into the entry, and knocked with his knuckles at the parlour door. It was opened presently by a woman with a child in her arms, whose unoccupied hand was hastily rearranging the upper part of her dress. This was Mrs. Plornish, and this material action was the action of Mrs. Plornish during a large part of her waking existence. Was Mr. Plornish at home? "Well, sir," said Mrs. Plornish, a civil woman, "not to deceive you, he's gone to look for a job." "Not to deceive you," was a method of speech with Mrs. Plornish. She would deceive you under any circumstances as little as might be. But she had a trick of answering in this provisional form. "Do you think he will be back soon, if I wait for him?" "I have been expecting him," said Mrs. Plornish, "this half an hour, at any minute of time. Walk in, sir." Arthur entered the rather dark and close parlour, though it was lofty too, and sat down in the chair she placed for him. "Not to deceive you, sir, I notice it," said Mrs. Plornish, "and I take it kind of you." He was at a loss to understand what she meant, and by expressing as much in his looks, elicited her explanation. "It ain't many that comes into a poor place that deems it worth their while to move their hats," said Mrs. Plornish, "but people think more of it than people think." Clennam returned, with an uncomfortable feeling in so very slight a courtesy being unusual, was that all? And stooping down to pinch the cheek of another young child who was sitting on the floor, staring at him, asked Mrs. Plornish how old that fine boy was. 4 year just turned, sir," said Mrs. Plornish. "He is a fine little fellow, ain't he, sir? But this one is rather sickly." She tenderly hushed the baby in her arms as she said it. "You wouldn't mind my asking if it happened to be a job as you was come about, sir, would you?" asked Mrs. Plornish wistfully. She asked it so anxiously that if he had been in possession of any kind of tenement, he would have had it plastered a foot deep rather than answer no. But he was obliged to answer no, and he saw a shade of disappointment on her face, as she checked a sigh and looked at the low fire. Then he saw also that Mrs. Plornish was a young woman made somewhat slatternly in herself and her belongings by poverty, and so dragged at by poverty and the children together, that their united forces had already dragged her face into wrinkles. "All such things as jobs," said Mrs. Plornish, "seems to me to have gone underground, they do indeed." Herein Mrs. Plornish limited her remark to the plastering trade, and spoke without reference to the Circumlocution Office and the Barnacle family. "Is it so difficult to get work?" asked Arthur Clennam. "Plornish finds it so," she returned. "He is quite unfortunate. Really he is." Really he was. He was one of those many wayfarers on the road of life who seem to be afflicted with supernatural corns, rendering it impossible for them to keep up even with their lame competitors. A willing, working, soft-hearted, not hard-headed fellow, Plornish took his fortune as smoothly as could be expected, but it was a rough one. It so rarely happened that anybody seemed to want him, it was such an exceptional case when his powers were in any request, that his misty mind could not make out how it happened. He took it as it came, therefore. He tumbled into all kinds of difficulties, and tumbled out of them, and, by tumbling through life, got himself considerably bruised. "It's not for want of looking after jobs, I am sure," said Mrs. Plornish, lifting up her eyebrows, and searching for a solution of the problem between the bars of the grate. "Nor yet for want of working at them when they are to be got. No one ever heard my husband complain of work." Somehow or other, this was the general misfortune of Bleeding Heart Yard. From time to time there were public complaints, pathetically going about, of labour being scarce, which certain people seemed to take extraordinarily ill, as though they had an absolute right to it on their own terms, but Bleeding Heart Yard, though as willing a yard as any in Britain, was never the better for the demand. That high old family, the Barnacles, had long been too busy with their great principle to look into the matter, and indeed the matter had nothing to do with their watchfulness in outgeneraling all other high old families except the Stiltstalkings. While Mrs. Plornish spoke in these words of her absent lord, her lord returned. A smooth-cheeked, fresh-coloured, sandy-whiskered man of 30, long in the legs, yielding at the knees, foolish in the face, flannel-jacketed, lime-whitened. "This is Plornish, sir?" "I came," said Clennam, rising, "to beg the favour of a little conversation with you on the subject of the Dorrit family." Plornish became suspicious, seemed to scent a creditor, said, "Ah, yes, well," he didn't know what satisfaction he could give any gentleman respecting that family. What might it be about now? "I know you better," said Clennam, smiling, "than you suppose." Plornish observed, not smiling in return, and yet he hadn't the pleasure of being acquainted with the gentleman neither. "No," said Arthur, "I know your kind offices at second hand, but on the best authority. Through little Dorrit. I mean," he explained, "Miss Dorrit." "Mr. Clennam, is it? Oh, I've heard of you, sir." "And I of you," said Arthur. "Please to sit down, sir, and consider yourself welcome." "Why, yes," said Plornish, taking a chair and lifting the elder child upon his knee, that he might have the moral support of speaking to a stranger over his head. "I have been on the wrong side of the lock myself, and in that way we come to know Miss Dorrit. Me and my wife, we are all acquainted with Miss Dorrit." "Intimate!" cried Mrs. Plornish. Indeed, she was so proud of the acquaintance that she had awakened some bitterness of spirit in the yard by magnifying to an enormous amount the sum for which Miss Dorrit's father had become insolvent. The Bleeding Hearts resented her claiming to know people of such distinction. "It was her father that I got acquainted with first, and through getting acquainted with him, you see, why, I got acquainted with her," said Plornish tautologically. "I see. Ah, and there's manners, there's polish, there's a gentleman to have run to see it in the Marshalsea jail." "Why, perhaps you're not aware," said Plornish, lowering his voice, and speaking with a perverse admiration of what he ought to have pitied or despised, not aware that Miss Dorrit and her sister durstn't let him know that they work for a living. No, said Plornish, looking with a ridiculous triumph first at his wife, and then all round the room. Durstn't let him know it, they durstn't. Without admiring him for that, Clennam quietly observed, I am very sorry for him. The remark appeared to suggest to Plornish, for the first time, that it might not be a very fine trait of character after all. He pondered about it for a moment, and gave it up. As to me, he resumed, certainly Mr. Dorrit is as affable with me, I am sure, as I can possibly expect, considering the differences and distances betwixt us, more so. But it's Miss Dorrit that we were speaking of. True. Pray, how did you introduce her at my mother's? Mr. Plornish picked a bit of lime out of his whisker, put it between his lips, turned it with his tongue like a sugar-plum, considered, found himself unequal to the task of lucid explanation, and appealing to his wife, said, Sally, you may as well mention how it was, old woman. Miss Dorrit, said Sally, hushing the baby from side to side, and laying her chin upon the little hand as it tried to disarrange the gown again, came here one afternoon with a bit of writing, telling that how she wished for needlework, and asked if it would be considered any ill-convenience in case she was to give her address here. Plornish repeated, her address here, in a low voice, as if he were making responses at church. Me and Plornish says, no, Miss Dorrit, no ill-convenience. Plornish repeated, no ill-convenience. And she wrote it in according, which then me and Plornish says, Ho, Miss Dorrit. Plornish repeated, Ho, Miss Dorrit. Have you thought of copying it 3 or 4 times, as the way to make it known in more places than one? No, says Miss Dorrit, I have not, but I will. She copied it out according, on this table, in a sweet writing, and Plornish, he took it where he worked, having a job just then. Plornish repeated, job just then. And likewise to the landlord of the yard, through which it was that Mrs. Clennam first happened to employ Miss Dorrit. Plornish repeated, employ Miss Dorrit. And Mrs. Plornish, having come to an end, feigned to bite the fingers of the little hand as she kissed it. The landlord of the yard, said Arthur Clennam, is Mr. Casby by name, he is, said Plornish, and Panks, he collects the rents. That, added Mr. Plornish, dwelling on the subject with a slow thoughtfulness that appeared to have no connection with any specific object, and to lead him nowhere. That is about what they are, you may believe me or not, as you think proper. Ay? Returned Clennam, thoughtful in his turn. Mr. Casby, too? An old acquaintance of mine, long ago. Mr. Plornish did not see his road to any comment on this fact, and made none, as there truly was no reason why he should have the least interest in it. Arthur Clennam went on to the present purport of his visit, namely, to make Plornish the instrument of effecting Tip's release, with as little detriment as possible to the self-reliance and self-helpfulness of the young man, supposing him to possess any remnant of those qualities. Without doubt a very wide stretch of supposition. Plornish, having been made acquainted with the course of action from the defendant's own mouth, gave Arthur to understand that the plaintiff was a chaunter, meaning not a singer of anthems, but a seller of horses, and that he, Plornish, considered that 10 shillings in the pound would settle handsome, and that more would be a waste of money. The principal and instrument soon drove off together to a stable yard in High Holborn, where a remarkably fine grey gelding, worth at the lowest figure 75 guineas, not taking into account the value of the shot he had been made to swallow for the improvement of his form, was to be parted with for a 20-pound note, in consequence of his having run away last week with Mrs. Captain Barbary of Cheltenham, who wasn't up to a horse of his courage, and who, in mere spite, insisted on selling him for that ridiculous sum, or, in other words, on giving him away. Plornish, going up this yard alone and leaving his principal outside, found a gentleman with tight drab legs, a rather old hat, a little hooked stick, and a blue neckerchief, Captain Maroon of Gloucestershire. a private friend of Captain Barbary, who happened to be there in a friendly way, to mention these little circumstances concerning the remarkably fine grey gelding to any real judge of a horse and quick snapper-up of a good thing, who might look in at that address as per advertisement. This gentleman, happening also to be the plaintiff in the tip case, referred Mr. Plornish to his solicitor, and declined to treat with Mr. Plornish, or even to endure his presence in the yard, unless he appeared there with a £20 note, in which case only the gentleman would augur from appearances that he meant business, and might be induced to talk to him. On this hint, Mr. Plornish retired to communicate with his principal, and presently came back with the required credentials. Then said Captain Maroon,
"Now, how much time do you want to make the other 20 in? Now, I'll give you a month."
Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit,
"Now, I'll tell what I'll do with you. You shall get me a good bill at 4 months, made payable at a banking house for the other 20.
Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit,
"Now come, here's the last I've got to say to you. You shall give me another 10 down, and I'll run my pen clean through it."
Then said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit,
"Now, I'll tell you what it is, and this shuts it up. He has used me bad, but I'll let him off for another 5 down and a bottle of wine. And if you mean done, say done, and if you don't like it, leave it."
Finally said Captain Maroon, when that wouldn't suit either,
"Hand over, then."
And in consideration of the first offer, gave a receipt in full, and discharged the prisoner. "Mr. Plornish," said Arthur, "I trust to you, if you please, to keep my secret. If you will undertake to let the young man know that he is free, and to tell him that you are employed to compound for the debt by some one whom you are not at liberty to name, you will not only do me a service, but may do him one, and his sister also."
"The last reason, sir," said Plornish, "would be quite sufficient. Your wishes shall be attended to."
"A friend has obtained his discharge, you can say if you please. A friend who hopes that for his sister's sake, if for no one else's, he will make good use of his liberty."
"Your wishes, sir, shall be attended to."
"And if you will be so good, in your better knowledge of the family, as to communicate freely with me, and to point out to me any means by which you think I may be delicately and really useful to little Dorrit, I shall feel under an obligation to you."
"Don't name it, sir," returned Plornish. "It'll be equally a pleasure and
Finding himself unable to balance his sentence after 2 efforts, Mr. Plornish wisely dropped it. He took Clennam's card, and appropriate pecuniary compliment. He was earnest to finish his commission at once, and his principal was in the same mind. So his principal offered to set him down at the Marshalsea gate, and they drove in that direction over Blackfriars Bridge. On the way, Arthur elicited from his new friend a confused summary of the interior life of Bleeding Heart Yard. "They was all hard up there," Mr. Plornish said, "uncommon hard up, to be sure. Well, he couldn't say how it was. He didn't know as anybody could say how it was. All he knowed was, that so it was. When a man felt, on his own back and in his own belly, that poor he was, that man, Mr. Plornish gave it as his decided belief, knowed well that he was poor somehow or another, and you couldn't talk it out of him, no more than you could talk beef into him. Then you see, some people as was better off said, and a good many such people lived pretty close up to the mark themselves, if not beyond it, so he'd heard, that they was improvident, that was the favourite word down the yard. For instance, if they see a man with his wife and children going to Hampton Court in a van, perhaps once in a year, they says, "Hullo, I thought you was poor, my improvident friend." Why, Lord, how hard it was upon a man! What was a man to do? He couldn't go melancholy mad, and even if he did, you wouldn't be the better for it. In Mr. Plornish's judgment, you would be the worse for it. Yet you seemed to want to make a man melancholy mad. You was always at it, If not with your right hand, with your left. What was there doing in the yard? Why, take a look at 'em and see. There was the girls and their mothers a-working at their sewing, or their shoe-binding, or their trimming, or their waistcoat-making, day and night and day, and not more than able to keep body and soul together after all, often not so much. There was people of pretty well all sorts of trades you could name, all wanting to work and yet not able to get it. There was old people, after working all their lives, going and being shut up in the workhouse, much worse fed and lodged and treated altogether than— Mr. Plornish said manufacturers, but appeared to mean malefactors. Why, a man didn't know where to turn himself for a crumb of comfort. As to who was to blame for it, Mr. Plornish didn't know who was to blame for it. He could tell you who suffered, but he couldn't tell you whose fault it was. It wasn't his place to find out, and who'd mind what he said if he did find out? He only knowed that it wasn't put right by them what undertook that line of business, and that it didn't come right of itself. And, in brief, his illogical opinion was that if you couldn't do nothing for him, you had better take nothing from him for doing of it, so far as he could make out what was about what it come to. Thus, in a prolix, gently growling, foolish way, did Plornish turn the tangled skein of his estate about and about, like a blind man who was trying to find some beginning or end to it, until they reached the prison gate. There he left his principal alone, to wonder, as he rode away, how many thousand Plornishes there might be within a day or two's journey of the Circumlocution Office, playing sundry curious variations on the same tune, which were not known by ear in that glorious institution. End of chapter the 12th. Book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 13th. Book the 1st. Of Little Dorrit. Read for LibriVox.org by Ellis Christoph. Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Book the 1st. Chapter the 13th. Patriarchal. The mention of Mr. Casby again revived in Clennam's memory the smouldering embers of curiosity and interest which Mrs. Flintwinch had fanned on the night of his arrival. Flora Casby had been the beloved of his boyhood, and Flora was the daughter and only child of wooden-headed old Christopher, so he was still occasionally spoken of by some irreverent spirits who had had dealings with him, and in whom familiarity had bred its proverbial results perhaps, who was reputed to be rich in weekly tenants, and to get a good quantity of blood out of the stones of several unpromising courts and alleys. After some days of inquiry and research, Arthur Clennam became convinced that the case of the father of the Marshalsea was indeed a hopeless one, and sorrowfully resigned the idea of helping him to freedom again. He had no hopeful inquiry to make at present concerning Little Dorrit either, but he argued with himself that it might, for anything he knew, it might be serviceable to the poor child if he renewed this acquaintance. It is hardly necessary to add that beyond all doubt he would have presented himself at Mr. Casby's door, if there had been no Little Dorrit in existence, for we all know how we all deceive ourselves, that is to say, how people in general, our profounder selves excepted, deceive themselves as to motives of action. With a comfortable impression upon him, and quite an honest one in its way, that he was still patronizing Little Dorrit in doing what had no reference to her, he found himself one afternoon at the corner of Mr. Casby's street. Mr. Casby lived in a street in the Gray's Inn Road, which had set off from that thoroughfare with the intention of running at one heat down into the valley, and up again to the top of Pentonville Hill, but which had run itself out of breath in 20 yards, and had stood still ever since. There is no such place in that part now, but it remained there for many years, looking with a balked countenance at the wilderness patched with unfruitful gardens, and pimpled with eruptive summer-houses, that it had meant to run over in no time. The house, thought Clennam, as he crossed to the door, is as little changed as my mother's, and looks almost as gloomy, but the likeness ends outside. I know its state of repose within. The smell of its jars of old rose leaves and lavender seems to come upon me even here." When his knock at the bright brass knocker of obsolete shape brought a woman servant to the door, those faded scents in truth saluted him like wintry breath that had a faint remembrance in it of the bygone spring. He stepped into the sober, silent, air-tight house. One might have fancied it to have been stifled by mutes in the Eastern manner, and the door, closing again, seemed to shut out sound and motion. The furniture was formal, grave, and Quaker-like, but well kept, and had as prepossessing an aspect as anything, from a human creature to a wooden stool, that is meant for much use and is preserved for little can ever wear. There was a grave clock ticking somewhere up the staircase, and there was a songless bird in the same direction, pecking at its cage, as if he were ticking too. The parlour fire ticked in the grate. There was only one person on the parlour hearth, and the loud watch in his pocket ticked audibly. The servant-maid had ticked the 2 words, "Mr. Clennam," so softly that she had not been heard, and he consequently stood within the door she had closed, unnoticed. The figure of a man advanced in life, whose smooth grey eyebrows seemed to move to the ticking as the firelight flickered on them, sat in an arm-chair, with his list shoes on the rug, and his thumbs slowly revolving over one another. This was old Christopher Casby, recognisable at a glance, as unchanged in 20 years, and upward as his own solid furniture, as little touched by the influence of the varying seasons, as the old rose leaves and old lavender in his porcelain jars. Perhaps there never was a man, in this troublesome world, so troublesome for the imagination to picture as a boy, and yet he had changed very little in his progress through life. Confronting him, in the room in which he sat, was a boy's portrait, which anybody seeing him would have identified as Master Christopher Casby, aged 10, though disguised with a haymaking rake, for which he had had at any time as much taste or use as for a diving bell, and sitting on one of his own legs upon a bank of violets, moved to precocious contemplation by the spire of a village church. There was the same smooth face and forehead, the same calm blue eye, the same placid air, the shining bald head, which looked so very large because it shone so much, and the long grey hair at its sides and back, like floss silk or spun glass, which looked so very benevolent because it was never cut, were not of course to be seen in the boy as in the old man. Nevertheless, in the seraphic creature with the haymaking rake were clearly to be discerned the rudiments of the patriarch with the list shoes. Patriarch was the name which many people delighted to give him. Various old ladies in the neighbourhood spoke of him as the last of the patriarchs. So grey, so slow, so quiet, so impassionate, so very bumpy in the head, patriarch was the word for him. He had been accosted in the streets, and respectfully solicited to become a patriarch for painters and for sculptors, with so much importunity, in sooth, that it would appear to be beyond the fine arts to remember the points of a patriarch, or to invent one. Philanthropists of both sexes had asked who he was, and on being informed, old Christopher Casby, formerly town agent to Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle, had cried in a rapture of disappointment, "Oh, why, with that head, is he not a benefactor to his species? Oh, why, with that head, is he not a father to the orphan and a friend to the friendless? With that head, however, he remained old Christopher Casby, proclaimed by common report rich in house property, and with that head he now sat in his silent parlour. Indeed, it would be the height of unreason to expect him to be sitting there without that head." Arthur Clennam moved to attract his attention, and the grey eyebrows turned towards him. "I beg your pardon," said Clennam. "I fear you did not hear me announced."
"No, sir, I did not. Did you wish to see me, sir?"
"I wished to pay my respects." Mr. Casby seemed a feather's weight disappointed by the last words, having perhaps prepared himself for the visitor's wishing to pay something else.
"Have I the pleasure, sir?"
he proceeded.
"Take a chair, if you please. Have I the pleasure of knowing—"
"Oh, truly, yes, I think I have. I believe I am not mistaken in supposing that I am acquainted with those features. I think I address a gentleman of whose return to this country I was informed by Mr. Flintwinch. That is your present visitor."
"Really, Mr. Clennam?"
"No other, Mr. Casby."
"Mr. Clennam, I am glad to see you.
How have you been since we met?" Without thinking it worth while to explain that in the course of some quarter of a century he had experienced occasional slight fluctuations in his health and spirits, Clennam answered generally that he had never been better, or something equally to the purpose, and shook hands with the possessor of that head as it shed its patriarchal light upon him.
"We are older, Mr. Clennam,"
said Christopher Casby.
"We are not younger,"
said Clennam. After this wise remark, he felt that he was scarcely shining with brilliancy, and became aware that he was nervous.
"And your respected father,"
said Mr. Casby,
"is no more. I was grieved to hear it, Mr. Clennam, I was grieved."
Arthur replied in the usual way that he felt infinitely obliged to him.
"There was a time,"
said Mr. Casby, "when your parents and myself were not on friendly terms. There was a little family misunderstanding among us. Your respected mother was rather jealous of her son, maybe. When I say her son, I mean your worthy self, your worthy self." His smooth face had a bloom upon it like ripe wall fruit. What with his blooming face, and that head, and his blue eyes, he seemed to be delivering sentiments of rare wisdom and virtue. In like manner, his physiognomical expression seemed to teem with benignity. Nobody could have said where the wisdom was, or where the virtue was, or where the benignity was, but they all seemed to be somewhere about him.
"Those times, however,"
pursued Mr. Casby, "are past and gone, past and gone. I do myself the pleasure of making a visit to your respected mother occasionally, and of admiring the fortitude and strength of mind with which she bears her trials, When he made one of these little repetitions, sitting with his hands crossed before him, he did it with his head on one side, and a gentle smile, as if he had something in his thoughts too sweetly profound to be put into words, as if he denied himself the pleasure of uttering it, lest he should soar too high, and his meekness therefore preferred to be unmeaning. "I have heard that you were kind enough on one of those occasions," said Arthur, catching at the opportunity as it drifted past him, "to mention little Dorrit to my mother."
"Little Dorrit? That's the seamstress who was mentioned to me by a small tenant of mine? Yes, Dorrit, that's the name. Ah, yes, you call her Little Dorrit?"
No road in that direction. Nothing came of the cross cut. It led no further.
"My daughter Flora," said Mr. Casby. "As you may have heard probably, Mr. Clennam was married and established in life several years ago. She had the misfortune to lose her husband when she had been married a few months. She resides with me again. She will be glad to see you if you will permit me to let her know that you are here."
"By all means," returned Clennam. "I should have preferred the request if your kindness had not anticipated me." Upon this, Mr. Casby rose up in his list shoes, and with a slow, heavy step, he was of an elephantine build, made for the door. He had a long, white-skirted bottle-green coat on, and a bottle-green pair of trousers, and a bottle-green waistcoat. The patriarchs were not dressed in bottle-green broadcloth, and yet his clothes looked patriarchal. He had scarcely left the room, and allowed the ticking to become audible again, when a quick hand turned a latchkey in the house door, opened it, and shut it. Immediately afterwards, A quick and eager, short, dark man came into the room with so much way upon him that he was within a foot of Clennam before he could stop. "Hullo!" he said. Clennam saw no reason why he should not say hello too. "What's the matter?" said the short, dark man. "I have not heard that anything is the matter," returned Clennam. "Where's Mr. Casby?" asked the short, dark man, looking about. "He will be here directly if you want him." "I want him?" said the short, dark man. "Don't you?" This elicited a word or two of explanation from Clennam, during the delivery of which the short, dark man held his breath and looked at him. He was dressed in black and rusty iron grey, had jet-black beads of eyes, a scrubby little black chin, wiry black hair striking out from his head in prongs, like forks or hairpins, and a complexion that was very dingy by nature, or very dirty by art, or a compound of nature and art. He had dirty hands and dirty broken nails, and looked as if he had been in the coals. He was in a perspiration, and snorted and sniffed and puffed and blew, like a little labouring steam engine. "Oh," said he, when Arthur told him how he came to be there. "Very well, that's right. If you should ask for Panks, will you be so good as to say that Panks is coming?" And so, with a snort and a puff, he worked out by another door. Now, in the old days at home, certain audacious doubts respecting the last of the patriarchs, which were afloat in the air, had by some forgotten means come into contact with Arthur's sensorium. He was aware of motes and specks of suspicion in the atmosphere of that time, seen through which medium Christopher Casby was a mere inn signpost, without any inn, an invitation to rest and be thankful when there was no place to put up at, and nothing whatever to be thankful for. He knew that some of these specks even represented Christopher as capable of harbouring designs in that head, and as being a crafty impostor. Other motes there were, which showed him as a heavy, selfish, drifting booby, who, having stumbled in the course of his unwieldy jostlings against other men, on the discovery that to get through life with ease and credit he had but to hold his tongue, keep the bald part of his head well polished, and leave his hair alone, had had just cunning enough to seize the idea and stick to it. It was said that his being town agent to Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle was referable, not to his having the least business capacity, but to his looking so supremely benignant that nobody could suppose the property screwed or jobbed under such a man. Also, that for similar reasons he now got more money out of his own wretched lettings, unquestioned, than anybody with a less knobby and less shining crown could possibly have done. In a word, it was represented, Clennam called to mind, alone in the ticking parlour, that many people select their models much as the painters just now mentioned select theirs, and that, whereas in the Royal Academy some evil old ruffian of a dog-stealer will annually be found embodying all the cardinal virtues, on account of his eyelashes, or his chin, or his legs, thereby planting thorns of confusion in the breasts of the more observant students of nature, so, in the great social exhibition, accessories are often accepted in lieu of the internal character. Calling these things to mind, and ranging Mr. Panks in a row with them, Arthur Clennam leaned this day to the opinion, without quite deciding on it, that the last of the patriarchs was the drifting booby aforesaid, with the one idea of keeping the bald part of his head highly polished, and that, much as an unweedy ship in the Thames River may sometimes be seen heavily drifting with the tide, broadside on, stern first, in its own way, and in the way of everything else, though making a great show of navigation, when all of a sudden a little coaly steam tug will bear down upon it, take it in tow, and bustle off with it. Similarly, the cumbrous patriarch had been taken in a tow by the snorting Panks, and was now following in the wake of that dingy little craft. The return of Mr. Casby with his daughter Flora put an end to these meditations. Clennam's eyes no sooner fell upon the subject of his old passion, than it shivered and broke to pieces. Most men will be found sufficiently true to themselves to be true to an old idea. It is no proof of an inconstant mind, but exactly the opposite, when the idea will not bear close comparison with the reality, and the contrast is a fatal shock to it. Such was Clennam's case. In his youth he had ardently loved this woman, and had heaped upon her all the locked-up wealth of his affection and imagination. That wealth had been, in his desert home, like Robinson Crusoe's money, exchangeable with no one, lying idle in the dark to rust, until he poured it out for her. Ever since that memorable time, though he had, until the night of his arrival, as completely dismissed her from any association with his present or future, as if she had been dead, which she might easily have been for anything he knew, he had kept the old fancy of the past unchanged, in its old sacred place. And now, after all, the last of the patriarchs coolly walked into the parlour, saying in effect, "Be good enough to throw it down and dance upon it. This is Flora." Flora, always tall, had grown to be very broad too, and short of breath. But that was not much. Flora, whom he had left a lily, had become a peony. But that was not much. Flora, who had seemed enchanting in all she said and thought, was diffuse and silly. That was much. Flora, who had been spoiled and artless long ago, was determined to be spoiled and artless now. That was a fatal blow. This is Flora. "I am sure," giggled Flora, tossing her head with a caricature of her girlish manner, such as a mamma might have presented at her own funeral, if she had lived and died in classical antiquity. "I am ashamed to see Mr. Clennam. I am a mere fright. I know he'll find me fearfully changed. I am actually an old woman. It's shocking to be found out. It's really shocking." He assured her that she was just what he had expected, and that time had not stood still with himself. "Oh, but with a gentleman it's so different, and really you look so amazingly well that you have no right to say anything of the kind, while as to me, you know, oh," cried Flora with a little scream, "I am dreadful." The patriarch, apparently not yet understanding his own part in the drama under representation, glowed with vacant serenity. "But if we talk of not having changed," said Flora, who, whatever she said, never once came to a full stop, "look at Papa. Is not Papa precisely what he was when you went away? Isn't it cruel and unnatural of Papa to be such a reproach to his own child? If we go on in this way much longer, people who don't know us will begin to suppose that I am Papa's mamma." "That must be a long time hence," Arthur considered. "Oh, Mr. Clennam, you're insincerest of creatures," said Flora. "I perceive already you have not lost your old way of paying compliments, your old way when you used to pretend to be so sentimentally struck, you know. At least, I don't mean that. I don't know what I mean." Here Flora tittered confusedly, and gave him one of her old glances. The patriarch, as if he now began to perceive that his part in the piece was to get off the stage as soon as might be, rose, and went to the door by which Panks had worked out, hailing that tug by name. He received an answer from some little dock beyond, and was stowed out of sight directly. "You mustn't think of going yet," said Flora. Arthur had looked at his hat, being in a ludicrous dismay, and not knowing what to do. "You could never be so unkind as to think of going, Arthur. I mean Mr. Arthur, or I suppose Mr. Clennam would be far more proper, but I am sure I don't know what I am saying, without a word about the dear old days gone for ever. When I come to think of it, I dare say it would be much better not to speak of them, and it's highly probable that you have some much more agreeable engagement, and pray let me be the last person in the world to interfere with it, though there was a time, but I am running into nonsense again." Was it possible that Flora could have been such a chatterer in the days she referred to? Could there have been anything like her present disjointed volubility in the fascinations that had captivated him? "Indeed, I have little doubt," said Flora, running on with astonishing speed, and pointing her conversation with nothing but commas, and very few of them, "that you are married to some Chinese lady, being in China so long, and being in business and naturally desirous to settle and extend your connection. Nothing was more likely than you should propose to a Chinese lady, and nothing was more natural, I am sure, than that the Chinese lady should accept you, and think herself very well off too. I only hope she is not a Pagodian dissenter." "I am not," returned Arthur, smiling in spite of himself, "married to any Lady Flora." "Oh, good gracious me! I hope you never kept yourself a bachelor so long on my account," tittered Flora. "But of course you never did. Why should you? Pray don't answer. I don't know where I'm running to. Oh, do tell me something about the Chinese ladies, whether their eyes are really so long and narrow, always putting me in mind of mother of pearl fish at cards, and do they really wear tails down their back and plaited too, or is it only the men? And when they pull their hair so very tight off their foreheads, don't they hurt themselves? And why do they stick little bells all over their bridges and temples and hats and things? Oh, don't they really do it?" Flora gave him another of her old glances. Instantly she went on again, as if he had spoken in reply for some time. "Then it's all true, and they really do. Good gracious, Arthur! Pray excuse me, old habit, Mr. Clennam, far more proper. What a country to live in for so long a time, and with so many lanterns and umbrellas too. How very dark and wet the climate ought to be, and no doubt actually is. And the sums of money that must be made by those two trades, where everybody carries them and hangs them everywhere. The little shoes too, and the feet screwed back in infancy, is quite surprising. What a traveller you are!" In his ridiculous distress, Clennam received another of the old glances without in the least knowing what to do with it. "Dear, dear," said Flora, "only to think of the changes at home, Arthur, cannot overcome it, and seem so natural, Mr. Clennam far more proper, since you became familiar with the Chinese customs and language, which I am persuaded you speak like a native, if not better, for you were always quick and clever, though immensely difficult, no doubt. I am sure the tea-chests alone would kill me if I tried. Such changes, Arthur, I am doing it again, seem so natural, most improper, as no one could have believed. Who could have ever imagined Mrs. Finching when I can't imagine it myself?" "Is that your married name?" asked Arthur, struck in the midst of all this by a certain warmth of heart that expressed itself in her tone when she referred, however oddly, to the youthful relation in which they had stood to one another. "Finching?" "Finching, oh yes, isn't it a dreadful name? But as Mr. F. said when he proposed to me, which he did 7 times and handsomely consented, I must say to be what he used to call on liking 12 months. After all, he wasn't answerable for it, and couldn't help it, could he? Excellent man! Not at all like you, but excellent man." Flora had at last talked herself out of breath for one moment, for she recovered breath in the act of raising a minute corner of her pocket-handkerchief to her eye, as a tribute to the ghost of the departed Mr. F., and began again. "No one could dispute, Arthur, Mr. Clennam, that it's quite right you should be formally friendly to me under the altered circumstances, and indeed you couldn't be anything else. At least I suppose not, you ought to know, but I can't help recalling that there was a time when things were very different." "My dear Mrs. Finching," Arthur began, struck by the good tone again. "Oh, not that nasty, ugly name. Say Flora." "Flora, I assure you, Flora, I am happy in seeing you once more, and in finding that, like me, you have not forgotten the old foolish dreams, when we saw all before us in the light of our youth and hope." "You don't seem so," pouted Flora. "You take it very coolly. But however, I know you are disappointed in me. I suppose the Chinese ladies, mandarinesses, if you call them so, are the cause, or perhaps I am the cause myself. It's just as likely." "No, no," Clennam entreated. "Don't say that." "Oh, I must, you know," said Flora in a positive tone. "What nonsense not to. I know I am not what you expected. I know that very well." In the midst of her rapidity, She had found that out with the quick perception of a cleverer woman. The inconsistent and profoundly unreasonable way in which she instantly went on, nevertheless, to interweave their long-abandoned boy and girl relations with their present interview, made Clennam feel as if he were light-headed. "One remark," said Flora, giving their conversation without the slightest notice, and to the great terror of Clennam, the tone of a love quarrel. "I wish to make, one explanation I wish to offer. When your mamma came and made a scene of it with my papa, and when I was called down into the little breakfast-room, where they were looking at one another with your mamma's parasol between them, seated on 2 chairs like mad bulls, what was I to do?" "My dear Mrs. Finching," urged Clennam, "all so long ago and so long concluded, is it worth while seriously to—" "I can't, Arthur," returned Flora, "be denounced as heartless by the whole society of China without setting myself right when I have the opportunity of doing so, and you must be very well aware that there was Paul and Virginia, which had to be returned, and which was returned without note or comment. Not that I mean to say you could have written to me watched as I was, but if it had only come back with a red wafer on the cover, I should have known that it meant come to Peking, Nankin, or what's the third place, barefoot." "My dear Mrs. Finching, you were not to blame, and I never blamed you. We were both too young, too dependent and helpless, to do anything but accept our separation. Pray think how long ago," gently remonstrated Arthur. "One more remark," proceeded Flora with unslackened volubility. "I wish to make, one more explanation I wish to offer. For 5 days I had a cold in the head from crying, which I passed entirely in the back drawing-room. There is the back drawing-room, still on the first floor, and still at the back of the house, to confirm my words. When that dreary period had passed, a lull succeeded, years rolled on, and Mr. F. became acquainted with us at a mutual friend's. He was all attention. He called next day. He soon began to call 3 evenings a week, and to send little things for supper. It was not love on Mr. F.'s part, it was adoration. Mr. F. proposed with the full approval of papa, and what could I do?" "Nothing whatever," said Arthur with the cheerfullest readiness. "But what you did, let an old friend assure you of his full conviction that you did quite right." "One last remark," proceeded Flora, rejecting commonplace life with a wave of her hand, "I wish to make, one last explanation I wish to offer. There was a time ere Mr. F. first paid attentions incapable of being mistaken, but that is past, and was not to be. Dear Mr. Clennam, you no longer wear a golden chain. You are free. I trust you may be happy. Here is papa, who is always tiresome and putting in his nose everywhere where he is not wanted." With these words, and with a hasty gesture fraught with timid caution, such a gesture had Clennam's eyes been familiar with in the old time, poor Flora left herself at 18 years of age, a long, long way behind again, and came to a full stop at last. Or rather, she left about half of herself at 18 years of age behind, and grafted the rest on to the relict of the late Mr. F., thus making a moral mermaid of herself, which her once boy-lover contemplated with feelings wherein his sense of the sorrowful and his sense of the comical were curiously blended. For example, as if there were a secret understanding between herself and Clennam of the most thrilling nature, as if the first of a train of post-chaises and 4 extending all the way to Scotland were at that moment round the corner, and as if she couldn't and wouldn't have walked into the parish church with him, under the shade of the family umbrella, with the patriarchal blessing on her head, and the perfect concurrence of all mankind. Flora comforted her soul with agonies of mysterious signalling, expressing dread of discovery. With the sensation of becoming more and more light-headed every minute, Clennam saw the relict of the late Mr. F. enjoying herself in the most wonderful manner, by putting herself and him in their old places, and going through all the old performances, now, when the stage was dusty, when the scenery was faded, when the youthful actors were dead, when the orchestra was empty, when the lights were out, and still, through all this grotesque revival of what he remembered as having once been prettily natural to her, he could not but feel that it revived at sight of him, and, that there was a tender memory in it. The patriarch insisted on his staying to dinner, and Flora signalled "Yes." Clennam so wished he could have done more than stay to dinner, so heartily wished he could have found the Flora that had been, or that never had been, that he thought the least atonement he could make for the disappointment he almost felt ashamed of, was to give himself up to the family desire. Therefore he stayed to dinner. Panks dined with them. Panks steamed out of his little dock at 6:15, and bore straight down for the patriarch, who happened to be then driving, in an inane manner, through a stagnant account of Bleeding Heart Yard. Panks instantly made fast to him and hauled him out.
"Bleeding Heart Yard?"
said Panks, with a puff and a snort.
"It's a troublesome property. Don't pay you badly, but rents are very hard to get there."
"You have more trouble with that one place than with all the places belonging to you." Just as the big ship in tow gets the credit, with most spectators, of being the powerful object, so the patriarch usually seemed to have said himself whatever Panks said for him. "Indeed?" returned Clennam, upon whom this impression was so efficiently made by a mere gleam of the polished head that he spoke the ship instead of the tug. "The people are so poor there?" "You can't say, you know," snorted Panks, taking one of his dirty hands out of his rusty iron-grey pockets to bite his nails, if he could find any, and turning his beads of eyes upon his employer. "Whether they are poor or not. They say they are, but they all say that. When a man says he's rich, you are generally sure he isn't. Besides, if they are poor, you can't help it. You'd be poor yourself if you didn't get your rents." "True enough," said Arthur. "You're not going to keep open house for all the poor of London," pursued Panks. "You're not going to lodge 'em for nothing. You're not going to open your gates wide and let 'em come free. Not if you know it, you ain't." Mr. Casby shook his head in placid and benignant generality. "If a man takes a room of you at £half-a-crown a week, and when the week comes round hasn't got the half-crown, you say to that man, 'Why have you got the room, then? If you haven't got the one thing, why have you got the other? What have you been and done with your money? What do you mean by it? What are you up to?' That's what you say to a man of that sort. And if you didn't say it, more shame for you." Mr. Panks here made a singular and startling noise, produced by a strong blowing effort in the region of the nose, unattended by any result but that acoustic one. "You have some extent of such property about the east and north-east here, I believe?" said Clennam, doubtful which of the two to address. "Oh, pretty well," said Panks. "You're not particular to east or north-east, any point of the compass will do for you. What you want is a good investment and a quick return. You take it where you can find it. You ain't nice as to situation, not you." There was a fourth and most original figure in the patriarchal tent, who also appeared before dinner. This was an amazing little old woman, with a face like a staring wooden doll too cheap for expression, and a stiff yellow wig perched unevenly on the top of her head, as if the child who owned the doll had driven a tack through it anywhere, so that it only got fastened on. Another remarkable thing in this little old woman was, that the same child seemed to have damaged her face in 2 or 3 places with some blunt instrument in the nature of a spoon. Her countenance, and particularly the tip of her nose, presenting the phenomena of several dints, generally answering to the bowl of that article. A further remarkable thing in this little old woman was, that she had no name but Mr. F.'s aunt. She broke upon the visitor's view under the following circumstances. Flora said, when the first dish was being put on the table, perhaps Mr. Clennam might not have heard that Mr. F. had left her a legacy. Clennam in return implied his hope that Mr. F. had endowed the wife whom he adored with the greater part of his worldly substance, if not with all. Flora said, "Oh, yes, she didn't mean that. Mr. F. had made a beautiful will, but he had left her as a separate legacy his aunt." She then went out of the room to fetch the legacy, and on her return, rather triumphantly presented Mr. F.'s aunt. The major characteristics discoverable by the stranger and Mr. F. Sant were extreme severity and grim taciturnity, sometimes interrupted by a propensity to offer remarks in a deep, warning voice, which, being totally uncalled for by anything said by anybody, and traceable to no association of ideas, confounded and terrified the mind. Mr. F. Sant may have thrown in these observations on some system of her own, and it may have been ingenious, or even subtle, but the key to it was wanted. The neatly served and well-cooked dinner, for everything about the patriarchal household promoted quiet digestion, began with some soup, some fried soles, a butter boat of shrimp sauce, and a dish of potatoes. The conversation still turned on the receipt of rents. Mr. F. Sant, after regarding the company for 10 minutes with a malevolent gaze, delivered the following fearful remark. "When we lived at Henley, Barnes's gander was stole by tinkers." Mr. Panks courageously nodded his head and said, "All right, ma'am." But the effect of this mysterious communication upon Clennam was absolutely to frighten him, and another circumstance invested this old lady with peculiar terrors. Though she was always staring, she never acknowledged that she saw any individual. The polite and attentive stranger would desire, say, to consult her inclinations on the subject of potatoes. His expressive action would be hopelessly lost upon her, and what could he do? No man could say, "Mr. F. Sant, will you permit me?" Every man retired from the spoon as Clennam did, cowed and baffled. There was mutton, a steak, and an apple pie, nothing in the remotest way connected with ganders, and the dinner went on like a disenchanted feast, as it truly was. Once upon a time Clennam had sat at that table taking no heed of anything but Flora. Now the principal heed he took of Flora was to observe, against his will, that she was very fond of porter, that she combined a great deal of sherry with sentiment, and that if she were a little overgrown, it was upon substantial grounds. The last of the patriarchs had always been a mighty eater, and he disposed of an immense quantity of solid food with the benignity of a good soul who was feeding someone else. Mr. Panks, who was always in a hurry, and who referred at intervals to a little dirty note-book which he kept beside him, perhaps containing the names of the defaulters he meant to look up by way of dessert, took in his victuals much as if he were coaling, with a good deal of noise, a good deal of dropping about, and a puff and a snort occasionally, as if he were nearly ready to steam away. All through dinner, Flora combined her present appetite for eating and drinking with her past appetite for romantic love, in a way that made Clennam afraid to lift his eyes from his plate, since he could not look towards her without receiving some glance of mysterious meaning or warning, as if they were engaged in a plot. Mr. F. Sant sat silently defying him with an aspect of the greatest bitterness, until the removal of the cloth and the appearance of the decanters, when she originated another observation, struck into the conversation like a clock without consulting anybody. Flora had just said, "Mr. Clennam, will you give me a glass of port for Mr. F. Sant?" "The monument near London Bridge," that lady instantly proclaimed, "was put up after the Great Fire of London, and the Great Fire of London was not the fire in which your Uncle George's workshops were burned down." Mr. Panks, with his former courage, said, "Indeed, ma'am, all right," but appearing to be incensed by imaginary contradiction, or rather ill-usage, Mr. F. Sant, instead of relapsing into silence, made the following additional proclamation: "I hate a fool." She imparted to this sentiment, in itself almost Solomonic, so extremely injurious and personal a character, by levelling it straight at the visitor's head, that it became necessary to lead Mr. F.'s aunt from the room. This was quietly done by Flora, Mr. F. Sant offering no resistance, but inquiring on her way out, "What he come there for, then?" with implacable animosity. When Flora returned, she explained that her legacy was a clever old lady, but was sometimes a little singular, and, took dislikes, peculiarities of which Flora seemed to be proud rather than otherwise. As Flora's good nature shone in the case, Clennam had no fault to find with the old lady for eliciting it, now that he was relieved from the terrors of her presence, and they took a glass or two of wine in peace. Foreseeing then that the Panks would shortly get under way, and that the patriarch would go to sleep, he pleaded the necessity of visiting his mother, and asked Mr. Panks in which direction he was going. "Citywards, sir," said Panks. "Shall we walk together?" said Arthur. "Quite agreeable," said Panks. Meanwhile Flora was murmuring in rapid snatches for his ear that there was a time, and that the past was a yawning gulf, however, and that a golden chain no longer bound him, and that she revered the memory of the late Mr. F., and that she should be at home to-morrow at 1:30, and that the decrees of fate were beyond recall, and that she considered nothing so improbable as that he ever walked on the north-west side of Gray's Inn Gardens at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He tried at parting to give his hand in frankness to the existing Flora, not the vanished Flora, or the mermaid, but Flora wouldn't have it, couldn't have it, was wholly destitute of the power of separating herself and him from their bygone characters. He left the house miserably enough, and so much more light-headed than ever, that if it had not been his good fortune to be towed away, he might for the first quarter of an hour have drifted anywhere. When he began to come to himself, in the cooler air and the absence of Flora, he found Panks at full speed, cropping such scanty pasturage of nails as he could find, and snorting at intervals. These, in conjunction with one hand in his pocket, and his roughened hat hind-side before, were evidently the conditions under which he reflected. "A fresh night," said Arthur. "Yes, it's pretty fresh," assented Panks. "As a stranger you feel the climate more than I do, I dare say. Indeed, I haven't got time to feel it." "You lead such a busy life?" "Yes, I have always some of them to look up, or something to look after. But I like business," said Panks, getting on a little faster. "What's a man made for?" "For nothing else?" said Clennam. Panks put the counter-question. "What else?" It packed up, in the smallest compass, a weight that had rested on Clennam's life, and he made no answer. "That's what I ask our weekly tenants," said Panks. "Some of them will pull long faces to me and say, 'Poor as you see us, master, we are always grinding, drudging, toiling, every minute we are awake.' I say to them, 'What else are you made for?' It shuts them up. They haven't a word to answer. 'What else are you made for?' That clinches it." "Oh, dear, dear, dear," sighed Clennam. "Here am I," said Panks, pursuing his argument with the weekly tenant. "What else do you suppose I think I am made for? Nothing. Rattle me out of bed early, set me going, give me as short a time as you like to bolt my meals in, and keep me at it. Keep me always at it, and I'll keep you always at it. You keep somebody else always at it. There you are with the whole duty of man in a commercial country." When they had walked a little further in silence, Clennam said, "Have you no taste for anything, Mr. Panks?" "What's taste?" dryly retorted Panks. "Let us say inclination." "I have an inclination to get money, sir," said Panks, "if you will show me how." He blew off that sound again, and it occurred to his companion for the first time that it was his way of laughing. He was a singular man in all respects. He might not have been quite in earnest, but that the short, hard, rapid manner in which he shot out these cinders of principles, as if it were done by mechanical revolvency, seemed irreconcilable with banter. "You are no great reader, I suppose?" said Clennam. "Never read anything but letters and accounts. Never collect anything but advertisements relative to next of kin. If that's a taste, I have got that." "You're not of the Clennams of Cornwall, Mr. Clennam?" "Not that I ever heard of." "I know you're not. I asked your mother, sir. She has too much character to let a chance escape her." supposing I had been of the Clennams of Cornwall? You'd have heard of something to your advantage. Indeed, I have heard of little enough to my advantage for some time. There's a Cornish property going a-begging, sir, and not a Cornish Clennam to have it for the asking," said Panks, taking his note-book from his breast-pocket and putting it in again. "I turn off here. I wish you good night." "Good night," said Clennam. But the tug, suddenly lightened and untrammelled by having any weight in tow, was already puffing away into the distance. They had crossed Smithfield together, and Clennam was left alone at the corner of Barbican. He had no intention of presenting himself in his mother's dismal room that night, and could not have felt more depressed and cast away if he had been in a wilderness. He turned slowly down Aldersgate Street, and was pondering his way along towards St. Paul's, purposing to come into one of the great thoroughfares for the sake of their light and life, when a crowd of people flocked towards him on the same pavement, and he stood aside against a shop to let them pass. As they came up, he made out that they were gathered round a something that was carried on men's shoulders. He soon saw that it was a litter, hastily made of a shutter or some such thing, and a recumbent figure upon it, and the scraps of conversation in the crowd, and a muddy bundle carried by one man, and a muddy hat carried by another, informed him that an accident had occurred. The litter stopped under a lamp before it had passed him 6 paces, for some readjustment of the burden, and, the crowd stopping too, he found himself in the midst of the array. "An accident going to the hospital?" he asked an old man beside him, who stood shaking his head, inviting conversation.
"Yes," said the man, "along of them mails. They ought to be prosecuted and fined, them mails. They come a-racing out of Lad Lane and Wood Street at 12 or 14 mile a hour, them miles do. The only wonder is that people ain't killed oftener by them miles."
"The person is not killed, I hope?"
"I don't know," said the man. "It ain't for the want of a will in them miles, if he ain't."
The speaker having folded his arms, and set in comfortably to address his depreciation of them miles to any of the bystanders who would listen, several voices, out of pure sympathy with the sufferer, confirmed him. One voice saying to Clennam, "They're a public nuisance, them miles, sir." Another, "I see one of them pull up within 1/2 inch of a boy last night." Another, "I see one of them go over a cat, sir, and it might have been your own mother." And all representing by implication that if he happened to possess any public influence, he could not use it better than against them miles.
"Why, a native Englishman is put to it every night of his life to save his life from them miles,"
argued the first old man.
"And he knows when they're a-coming round the corner to tear him limb from limb. What can you expect from a poor foreigner who don't know nothing about 'em?"
"Is this a foreigner?" said Clennam, leaning forward to look. In the midst of such replies as "Frenchman, sir," "Portuguese, sir," "Dutchman, sir," "Prussian, sir," and other conflicting testimony, he now heard a feeble voice asking, both in Italian and in French, for water. A general remark going round in reply of, "Ah, poor fellow, he says he'll never get over it, and no wonder." Clennam begged to be allowed to pass, as he understood the poor creature. He was immediately handed to the front to speak to him. "First, he wants some water," said he, looking round. A dozen good fellows dispersed to get it. "Are you badly hurt, my friend?" he asked the man on the litter in Italian. "Yes, sir, yes, yes, yes. It's my leg, but it pleases me to hear the old music, though I am very bad." "You are a traveller. Stay. See, the water. Let me give you some." They had rested the litter on a pile of paving stones. It was at a convenient height from the ground, and by stooping he could lightly raise the head with one hand and hold the glass to his lips with the other. A little, muscular, brown man, with black hair and white teeth. A lively face, apparently. Earrings in his ears. "That's well. You are a traveller?" "Surely, sir." "A stranger in this city?"
Surely, surely, altogether, I am arrived this unhappy evening.
From what country?
Marseille.
Why, see there, I also. Almost as much a stranger here as you, though born here, I came from Marseille a little while ago. Don't be cast down. The face looked up at him imploringly, as he rose from wiping it, and gently replaced the coat that covered the writhing figure. I won't leave you till you shall be well taken care of. Courage, you will be very much better half an hour hence.
Ah, altro,
cried the poor little man in a faintly incredulous tone, and as they took him up, hung out his right hand to give the forefinger a back-handed shake in the air. Arthur Clennam turned, and walking beside the litter, and saying an encouraging word now and then, accompanied it to the neighbouring hospital of St. Bartholomew. None of the crowd but the bearers and he being admitted, the disabled man was soon laid on a table in a cool, methodical way, and carefully examined by a surgeon who was as near at hand and as ready to appear as Calamity herself. "He hardly knows an English word," said Clennam. "Is he badly hurt?" "Let us know all about it first," said the surgeon, continuing his examination with a business-like delight in it, "before we pronounce." After trying the leg with a finger, and 2 fingers, and 1 hand, and 2 hands, and over and under, and up and down, and in this direction, and in that, and approvingly remarking on the points of interest to another gentleman who joined him, the surgeon at last clapped the patient on the shoulder and said, "He won't hurt, he'll do very well. It's difficult enough, but we shall not want him to part with his leg this time," which Clennam interpreted to the patient, who was full of gratitude, and, in his demonstrative way, kissed both the interpreter's hand and the surgeon's several times. "It's a serious injury, I suppose?" said Clennam. "Yes," replied the surgeon, with the thoughtful pleasure of an artist contemplating the work upon his easel. "Yes, it's enough. There's a compound fracture about the knee, and a dislocation below. They are both of a beautiful kind." He gave the patient a friendly clap on the shoulder again, as if he really felt that he was a very good fellow indeed, and worthy of all commendation for having broken his leg in a manner interesting to science. "He speaks French?" said the surgeon. "Oh yes, he speaks French." "He'll be at no loss here, then. You have only to bear a little pain like a brave fellow, my friend, and to be thankful that all goes as well as it does," he added in that tongue, "and you'll walk again to a marvel. Now let us see whether there's anything else the matter, and how our ribs are." There was nothing else the matter, and our ribs were sound. Clennam remained until everything possible to be done had been skilfully and promptly done. The poor belated wanderer in a strange land movingly besought that favour of him, and lingered by the bed to which he was in due time removed, until he had fallen into a doze. Even then he wrote a few words for him on his card, with a promise to return tomorrow, and left it to be given to him when he should awake. All these proceedings occupied so long that it struck 11 o'clock at night as he came out at the hospital gate. He had hired a lodging for the present in Covent Garden, and he took the nearest way to that quarter, by Snow Hill and Holborn. Left to himself again, after the solicitude and compassion of his last adventure, he was naturally in a thoughtful mood. As naturally, he could not walk on thinking for 10 minutes without recalling Flora. She necessarily recalled to him his life with all its misdirection and little happiness. When he got to his lodging, he sat down before the dying fire, as he had stood at the window of his old room looking out upon the blackened forest of chimneys, and turned his gaze back upon the gloomy vista by which he had come to that stage in his existence. So long, so bare, so blank. No childhood, no youth, except for one remembrance. That one remembrance proved, only that day, to be a piece of folly. It was a misfortune to him, trifle as it might have been to another, for, while all that was hard and stern in his recollection remained reality on being proved, was obdurate to the sight and touch, and relaxed nothing of its old indomitable grimness, the one tender recollection of his experience would not bear the same test, and melted away. He had foreseen this on the former night, when he had dreamed with waking eyes, but he had not felt it then, and he had now. He was a dreamer in such wise, because he was a man who had, deep-rooted in his nature, a belief in all the gentle and good things his life had been without. Bred in meanness and hard dealing, this had rescued him to be a man of honourable mind and open hand. Bred in coldness and severity, this had rescued him to have a warm and sympathetic heart. Bred in a creed too darkly audacious to pursue, through its process of reserving the making of man in the image of his Creator, to the making of his Creator in the image of an erring man, this had rescued him to judge not, and in humility to be merciful, and have hope and charity. And this saved him still from the whimpering weakness and cruel selfishness of holding that because such a happiness or such a virtue had not come into his little path, or worked well for him, therefore it was not in the great scheme, but was reducible, when found in appearance, to the basest elements. A disappointed mind he had, but a mind too firm and healthy for such unwholesome air. Leaving himself in the dark, it could rise into the light, seeing it shine on others and hailing it. Therefore, he sat before his dying fire, sorrowful to think upon the way by which he had come to that night, yet not strewing poison on the way by which other men had come to it. That he should have missed so much, and at his time of life should look so far about him for any staff to bear him company upon his downward journey and cheer it, was a just regret. He looked at the fire from which the blaze departed, from which the afterglow subsided, in which the ashes turned grey, from which they dropped to dust, and thought, "How soon I too shall pass through such changes, and be gone." To review his life was like descending a green tree in fruit and flower, and seeing all the branches wither and drop off one by one as he came down towards them. From the unhappy suppression of my youngest days, through the rigid and unloving home that followed them, through my departure, my long exile, my return, my mother's welcome, my intercourse with her since, down to the afternoon of this day with poor Flora, said Arthur Clennam, what have I found? His door was softly opened, and these spoken words startled him, and came as if they were an answer. Little Dorrit. End of chapter the 13th, book the 1st. This recording is in the public domain.